You wake up bald. You're wearing a robe. You don't remember joining anything. Too bad. Your uncle donated you to the monastery at age 7. Congratulations. You're now married to silence, soup, and God. The weight of being the third son in a medieval noble family was less a burden and more a meticulously crafted destiny, preordained by the ironclad laws of primogeniture and the stark realities of land ownership. Eldest sons, by the grace of God and the still heavier grace of their fathers, were the inheritors, the keepers of the ancestral flame, the inheritors of fields, forests, and castles. The second son, often cast in a more martial or clerical mold, was typically groomed for a life of service, be it defending the realm with a sword or praying for its salvation in the hallowed halls of the church. He was the designated backup, the strategic reserve in the unending game of dynastic succession. But the third son? The third son was the perennial orphan of the inheritance, the spare part in the grand family machine, a living testament to the Malthusian anxieties of noble households. Elias was, in every conceivable way, a quintessential third son. His father, Baron Armand, was a man of solid, if uninspired, lineage, a man who understood the importance of a well-managed estate, and more importantly, the necessity of keeping it undivided. Elias's birth was met not with a trumpeted fanfare of future glory, but with a quiet, pragmatic assessment of resources. He had 2 elder brothers, robust lads with the glint of ambition in their eyes and the expected paths of knighthood and abbacy already laid out before them like gilded carpets. Elias, on the other hand, was a pleasing enough child, healthy and bright, but destined to occupy a space that in his father's ledger was marked expendable. The family estate, a sprawling but increasingly strained collection of arable land, vineyards, and a somewhat drafty keep, was the sun around which their entire world orbited. Every decision, from the smallest alteration to the sheepfold to the most momentous marriage alliance, was made with the singular aim of preserving this patrimony, of ensuring its unimpaired passage to the eldest heir. Elias's existence, therefore, posed a minor yet persistent logistical challenge. What was to be done with this extra mouth to feed, this additional young man whose very presence could, through marriage or squabbles over patronage, potentially dilute the family's wealth and influence? The answer, as it was for countless families across Christendom, was elegantly simple and brutally efficient: the monastery. It was a solution so universally accepted, so deeply embedded in the social fabric, that it rarely gave rise to much in the way of moral hand-wringing. Monasteries were not merely houses of prayer. They were also, in a very real sense, sophisticated retirement homes, well-appointed orphanages, and remarkably effective family planning devices, all rolled into one. For a family like the Desmontaigne, it was the perfect disposal system for surplus sons. Baron Armand, a man who wouldn't hesitate to betroth his daughter to a decrepit but wealthy widower to solidify a land deal, saw Elias's monastic destiny as less a tragedy and more a fiscal advantage. He wouldn't have to find Elias a wife of suitable, red wealthy stock, nor would he need to purchase a commissions in the army or secure a lucrative position within the church for him. The monastery would provide Elias with sustenance, shelter, and a life of supposed spiritual fulfillment, all at no direct cost to the Baron. In return, the monastery would receive a dutiful, if unenthusiastic, recruit, and perhaps, if Elias proved particularly useful, a future donation from the grateful family. It was, in essence, a long term investment in spiritual insurance and dynastic tidiness. Elias, bless his naive heart, was kept blissfully unaware of the precise calculations that had been made regarding his future for the first 14 years of his life. He was allowed to chase rabbits in the woods, to learn the rudiments of riding and sword play, though his technique was often described as more enthusiastic than effective, and to enjoy the relative freedom of a boy whose lineage insulated him from the crushing labor that defined the lives of the peasantry. He was a child of privilege, albeit a distinctly secondary one. He knew he was not his father's favorite, nor his mother's pride and joy in the same way his elder brothers were, but the concept of being destined for a life of enforced celibacy and perpetual prayer had never truly crossed his mind. The revelation came, as such life-altering pronouncements often did, on a blustery autumn afternoon. Elias was summoned to his father's solar, a room that smelled perpetually of beeswax, aging parchment, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Baron Armand sat behind his heavy oak table, his expression one of stern finality, as if delivering a pronouncement on the weather rather than his son's entire future. His eldest son, Geoffrey, already a taciturn youth of 17, stood by the hearth, his presence a silent, imposing endorsement of their father's decree. Elias, his father began, his voice resonating with the weight of his patriarchal authority. You are no longer a child. You have reached the age where a man must consider his path. Geoffrey, as you know, will inherit the estate. Robert will join the Archbishop's retinue. They have their futures secured. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Elias with a dispassionate scrutiny, like a farmer assessing a young bull. Your path, my son, lies elsewhere. Elias, sensing the shift in tone, felt a prickle of unease. Where, father? He asked, his voice a little too high. Baron Armand leaned back, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. You will enter the Augustinian Abbey of St. Jerome, a venerable institution known for its scholarship and its dedication. He gestured with a ringed finger towards a beautifully illuminated manuscript lying open on the table, a book of hours, no doubt commissioned at great expense and destined for his own private devotion, not his third son's. You will find peace there, Elias, a life of purpose, of contemplation. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Peace? Contemplation? He, who dreamed of the hunt, of the jousting field, of the boisterous camaraderie of the camp. The Augustinian Abbey of St. Jerome was a formidable stone edifice, perched on a windswept hill overlooking the bleak northern coast. He had seen it from a distance, a silhouette against a perpetually gray sky, and had always imagined it as a place of stern austerity, a stark contrast to the relative comfort of his father's hall. But, father? Elias stammered, his mind reeling, desperately trying to grasp at any shred of an alternative. I don't feel called. To the religious life, I mean. Baron Armand's smile widened, a chilling display of paternal condescension. Called? My dear boy, the greatest calling is obedience. And the greatest wisdom is recognizing the hand of providence when it points you towards a stable future. Do you think your brothers felt a burning desire to embrace their duties? Number, they understand their roles, and yours, Elias, is to serve God and the family name in a manner that causes no disruption to the inheritance. He tapped the illuminated manuscript. This is the reality, Elias. Not all lives are meant for the grand stage. Some are meant for quieter, more significant roles behind the scenes. The monastery requires learned men, men of good breeding, to maintain its traditions and its influence. There was no room for argument. Elias could see it in the set of his father's jaw, in the unwavering gaze of his elder brother. This wasn't a discussion, it was a decree. His destiny, so long unwritten, had just been penned in indelible ink, not by divine inspiration, but by the cold, hard pragmatism of medieval inheritance law. He was to be offered up, a living sacrifice on the altar of dynastic continuity. His journey to St. Jerome was less a spiritual pilgrimage and more an enforced relocation. He was given a new, rough spun tunic, a meager travel allowance, and a stern lecture on the virtues of humility and obedience. His father's parting words were not a blessing, but a command. Do not disgrace the family name, and do not, under any circumstances, expect to inherit anything other than God's grace and a comfortable cell. The carriage ride was a somber affair. Elias cloistered with his thoughts, the monotonous rhythm of the wheels a counterpoint to the turmoil in his soul. He looked out at the passing landscape, the familiar fields, the distant villages, the lives of men and women who, by virtue of their birth or lack thereof, were largely spared this particular brand of familial sacrifice. He saw peasants toiling in the mud, their faces etched with hardship, but also with a certain groundedness, a connection to the land that he, as a third son destined for the cloister, would never truly know. His father's reasoning was, in its own brutal way, sound. The monastery was a haven, a place where his education would be continued, where he would be fed and clothed, and where he would be spared the indignities of a life without prospects. Unmarried men without land or a profession were a societal problem, a potential drain on resources, or worse, a source of social unrest. The church, with its vast network of institutions, provided a convenient solution to this perennial issue. It absorbed these men, channeling their energies into prayer, labor, and the preservation of knowledge, while simultaneously bolstering the church's own wealth and influence. Elias understood, intellectually, the forces that had conspired to bring him to this precipice. He was not the victim of a sudden misfortune, but the predictable outcome of a system that valued lineage and land above all else. He was a pawn, moved to a strategic position on the chessboard of his family's legacy, a position that required his presence, but not necessarily his enthusiasm. The journey to St. Jerome was not just a physical transition, it was a symbolic shedding of one identity, that of the unwanted son of a minor baron, for another, that of a monk, a man pledged to a life of service he had not chosen, a life dictated by the grim calculus of his father's desire to keep the family estate, and therefore the family name, unblemished and intact. His destiny had been sealed not by a divine whisper, but by the unshakable conviction that bloodlines and land were meant to be preserved, even at the cost of one son's unchosen path. The reek of stale ale and desperation clung to the air of the boar's tusk like a second skin. Elias, despite his newfound tonsure and the scratchy wool of his monastic habit, found himself drawn to the low murmur of voices emanating from its perpetually open, if rather grimy, door. It was a place where fortunes were made, and more frequently lost with alarming speed, a stark contrast to the measured, pious existence he was supposed to be cultivating within the austere walls of St. Jerome. He'd been dispatched on an errand for the abbot, a collection of tithes from the nearby village, a task meant to solidify his devotion to the Almighty, but which Elias increasingly suspected was a trial of his patience, a subtle test of whether he could resist the worldly temptations that his new life was supposed to have purged. He lingered near the entrance, the shadows of the eaves offering a decent cloak for his observation. The tavern pulsed with a life utterly alien to the hushed sanctity of the abbey. Here, the dominant symphony was not Gregorian chant, but the clatter of tankards, the boisterous laughter of men deep in their cups, and the sharp, percussive crack of dice against wood. It was a volatile orchestra, each note a potential harbinger of either fleeting joy or profound despair. Elias found himself a morbid observer, a specter haunting the fringes of a world he was meant to have left behind, his mind still wrestling with the abruptness of his own transition from a life of potential, however meager, to one of prescribed renunciation. His gaze fell upon a man hunched over a table, his face a mask of grim determination, etched with the undeniable lines of fatigue and too much cheap wine. Bartholomew, he'd heard him called. A carpenter by trade, his hands, Elias noted, were calloused and strong, accustomed to the bite of saw and chisel, not the fumbling grasp of dice. Yet, here he was, his entire worldly existence seemingly balanced on the outcome of a few wooden cubes. The air around him was thick with the unspoken drama of the gamble. The other patrons, a motley collection of farmers, blacksmiths, and a few disreputable-looking fellows with too many rings and not enough teeth, watched with the predatory stillness of wolves. Bartholomew threw the dice with a desperate flourish, a silent prayer, perhaps, escaping his lips before they were sealed by the sharp intake of breath from the onlookers. The dice tumbled, bounced, and settled. A collective groan, laced with a few disappointed grunts, rippled through the tavern. Bartholomew slumped forward, his head in his hands, the rough fabric of his tunic a stark contrast to the fine linen he had likely worn not so long ago. Elias, shielded by the darkness, felt a strange, cold kinship with the man's despair. His own father had gambled with his future, a far larger and more consequential wager, and the stakes for Bartholomew seemed all too familiar. The tavern keeper, a man whose gut strained the seams of his apron and whose eyes held the perpetual glint of avarice, approached Bartholomew's table. He spoke in low, rumbling tones, but Elias could infer the gist of their conversation from the carpenter's increasingly frantic gestures. The whispers among the surrounding patrons painted a grim picture. Bartholomew had lost not only his wages for the month, but also the collateral for a debt he had incurred to cover his previous losses. The tavern keeper, ever the shrewd businessman, offered a way out, a lifeline of sorts, albeit one forged from the chains of eternal servitude. Another throw, Bartholomew. The keeper's voice, amplified by the smoky air, boomed across the room. This time, for a different kind of coin. Sign these papers, and if the dice favor you, you're free. If not, well, the Abbey of St. Jude is always in need of good, honest labor. They pay handsomely for such contributions. Elias's blood ran cold. The Abbey of St. Jude. It was a distant, albeit wealthy, monastic order, known for its agricultural holdings and its skilled artisans. To pledge oneself to such an institution after losing one's freedom at the dice table was a common, if grim, resolution in these parts. It wasn't a divine calling that led these men to the cloister, but the unforgiving hand of circumstance, a cold, hard reality that clawed its way out of the bottom of an empty ale mug. Bartholomew looked at the parchment offered to him, his hand trembling as he reached for it. He glanced at the dice, then at the stern, unyielding face of the tavern keeper. He saw the leering faces of his creditors, their smiles thin and predatory. He saw the crushing weight of his debts, the shame that would follow him through the village, the scorn of his neighbors, and the certain ruin that awaited him if he failed to meet his obligations. In that moment, the promise of a roof over his head, 3 meals a day, and a life free from the crushing burden of debt, however unchosen, held a terrible, seductive appeal. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life, Bartholomew dipped the quill into the ink pot. He scratched his name onto the parchment, his usually steady hand now jerky and uncertain. The ink bled into the fibers of the paper, a physical manifestation of his surrendered will. The tavern erupted in a fresh wave of cheers, not for Bartholomew, but for the tavern keeper, who had just acquired a valuable asset without lifting a finger, save to point to a ledger. As Bartholomew rose, his shoulders stooped as if already bowed by the weight of his new monastic life. Elias felt a profound disquiet settle over him. He saw, in the carpenter's vacant stare, the echo of his own predicament. While Elias had been sent to St. Jerome, Bartholomew had been sold to it, a commodity traded in a transaction fueled by desperation and the capricious whims of chance. The difference, Elias mused, was perhaps only a matter of degree, a subtle shift in the machinery of fate. Both were bound, not by vows of piety, but by the cold, unyielding logic of consequence. He watched as Bartholomew was escorted out of the tavern, not by the tavern keeper, but by 2 burly men who seemed to have materialized from the shadows. Their task was not to offer comfort, but to ensure their new acquisition arrived safely at his new place of servitude. The patrons at the Boar's Tusk, their brief excitement over, returned to their own drinks, their own gambles, their own oblivion. For them, Bartholomew's fate was just another story, a cautionary tale to be mulled over with the next round. Elias, however, could not shake the image. He thought of the skills he himself possessed, his rudimentary ability to read and write, his knack for observation, his quiet demeanor. Were these not also a form of currency? He had been offered a life of contemplation, a life of learning, a life of service to God. But he also saw the darker undercurrents, the ways in which such institutions, with their vast wealth and influence, could become repositories for those who had lost their way, those who had gambled and lost, those whose lives had taken a turn for the worse, through no inherent fault of their own, but through the sheer bad luck of circumstance. He realized that the taverns, with their smoky dens of iniquity and their intoxicating allure of fleeting fortune, were not entirely separate from the monasteries. They were, in a strange and twisted way, two sides of the same coin. One offered spiritual salvation, the other, a more tangible, albeit enforced, salvation from worldly ruin. Both demanded a surrender, a renunciation of the self, though the motivations behind those surrenders were vastly different. Bartholomew's surrender was born of a lost wager. Elias's was born of a father's calculated strategy. As Elias continued his errand, the weight of the collected tithes felt heavier in his satchel. He felt a growing understanding of the intricate web of obligations and destinies that ensnared men in this age. Life was a gamble, and the stakes were often more than just coin. They were freedom, dignity, and the very trajectory of one's soul. The tavern, with its raucous symphony of despair and fleeting hope, had offered him a stark, unvarnished glimpse into the lives of those whose fates were sealed not by divine providence, but by the roll of the dice and the cold, hard arithmetic of debt. Bartholomew, the carpenter who became a monk through a lost bet, was a living testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound transformations occurred not in the quiet contemplation of a cloister, but in the smoky, desperate embrace of a tavern floor. He, Elias, the son of a baron, had been assigned to a monastery, a victim of primogeniture. Bartholomew the craftsman had been sold to one, a victim of chance. Both, however, were now bound by a similar fate. Their souls, in a very real sense, wagered, and in Bartholomew's case, irrevocably lost in the smoky haze of a tavern's cruel hospitality. The difference Elias knew was that Bartholomew had at least had a fighting chance to win his freedom back, a chance he had tragically squandered. Elias's chance had never truly existed in the first place, his future predetermined before he ever drew a breath. The sheer injustice of it, the casual cruelty of a system that could treat a man's life as a commodity to be traded, struck Elias with a force that left him momentarily breathless. He clutched the satchel of coins, the metallic weight a poor substitute for the peace he was supposed to be seeking. The laughter from the boar's tusk seemed to follow him, a mocking echo of the unbidden calling that had truly set him on this path, a path paved with the lost wages and wagered souls of men like Bartholomew. He had been spared the dice, but not the gamble. The weight of the tithes in Elias's satchel felt less like a spiritual offering and more like the heavy burden of a secret pact. The image of Bartholomew, the carpenter lost to the dice, was seared into his mind. It was a stark reminder that the cloister, while appearing as a haven of peace and divine contemplation, was often a destination for the broken, the desperate, and the discarded. Elias, son of a baron, had been offered to St. Jerome as a strategic move, a way to manage the estate and ensure a clear line of succession. Bartholomew, a craftsman, had been bought and sold by the fickle hand of chance. Both, however, were now bound by a similar fate, their earthly lives pledged to a divine institution, their freedoms forfeit not necessarily by choice, but by the unforgiving machinations of their respective circumstances. Bartholomew had at least had a chance, a fleeting, desperate hope of reclaiming his lost liberty on the felt of the gaming table. Elias's fate, on the other hand, had been sealed before he even understood the concept of a wager. His future a preordained bargain struck between his father and the abbot. The sheer inequity of it, the casual cruelty inherent in a system that treated a man's very existence as a negotiable asset, settled upon Elias with a suffocating finality. He clutched the coins, their metallic coldness a poor substitute for the spiritual solace he was meant to be finding. The raucous laughter emanating from the boar's tusk seemed to pursue him, a mocking echo of the unbidden calling that had truly set him on this path, a path seemingly paved with the lost wages and wagered souls of men like Bartholomew. He had been spared the dice, but not the gamble. The path Elias now trod, winding away from the cacophony of the tavern and towards the quietude of Saint Jerome, was also a path trod by countless others whose stories rarely made it into the hallowed halls of Scripture or the grand pronouncements of the Church. It was a path often paved not with divine intervention, but with the stark, unyielding realities of human need. For families mired in the perpetual twilight of poverty, or those burdened by a superfluity of mouths to feed, a monastery could present itself not as a spiritual calling, but as a grimly practical solution. This was not the noble self abnegation Elias was being encouraged to embrace, but a desperate transference of burden, a calculated divestment of responsibility. These were the unwritten contracts, the whispered agreements made in the shadow of desperation, where a child's future was traded for a parent's temporary respite. Consider the plight of Agnes, a wisp of a child barely old enough to toddle, her world as yet defined by the gentle warmth of her mother's embrace and the sweet, milky taste of nourishment. Agnes's mother, a widow whose days were a relentless cycle of scraping by, found herself caught in the unforgiving vice of scarcity. The meager earnings from her needlework, once enough to sustain her small family, now barely sufficed to fill her own stomach, let alone the demanding emptiness of her daughters. The winter had been particularly cruel, its icy grip tightening around the already fragile threads of their existence. Hunger was not an abstract concept. It was a gnawing ache in the belly, a persistent shadow that darkened even the brightest of days. The small cottage, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its thin walls offering little protection against the biting winds or the gnawing anxieties that plagued the mother's waking hours. Each cry from Agnes was a fresh stab of guilt, a reminder of her inability to provide, of her failure as a mother in the most fundamental of ways. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were haunted by Agnes's pinched face, her thin limbs, the ever-present specter of starvation. The Abbey of Saint Jerome, with its imposing stone walls and its reputation for providing sustenance and shelter, loomed in the distance like a mirage of salvation. It was a place of order, of routine, of guaranteed meals, however plain. For Agnes's mother, the decision was not one of faith, but of survival. It was a mother's agonizing choice, a testament to a love so profound it was willing to endure the agony of separation for the slim hope of her child's continued existence. She could not bear the thought of Agnes fading away in her arms, a slow, agonizing surrender to the inevitable. The alternative, however heartbreaking, offered a chance. It was a gamble, of course, but one where the stakes were life and death. One crisp autumn morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, Agnes's mother carried her daughter towards the abbey gates. The babe was swaddled tightly in her arms, her small face nestled against her mother's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the momentous, life altering journey she was embarking upon. The mother's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Each step was heavy with the weight of unspoken farewells. She walked through the dew laden fields, the familiar landscape of her struggles, now imbued with a somber significance. The air was clean and sharp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of her own impoverished dwelling. As she approached the massive wooden doors, an immense sense of trepidation washed over her. These were not doors that welcomed with open arms, but portals to a different existence, a world of renunciation and rigid discipline. She hesitated, her fingers tightening their grip on Agnes. What awaited her child within these hallowed walls? Would she be treated with the kindness and care her mother so desperately wished for her? Or would she be just another nameless face, another burden to be absorbed into the vast machinery of the monastic order? The questions gnawed at her, but the gnawing hunger in Agnes's belly, the memory of her daughter's increasingly listless cries, propelled her forward. With a trembling hand, she approached the small, low wicket gate set into the main entrance. It was designed for the passage of those who sought entry, but also for those who were sent away. She peered through the small opening, her heart constricting at the sight of the bleak stone courtyard beyond. It was a space devoid of warmth, of color, of the simple comforts that made a home. A few cloaked figures moved with practiced efficiency, their faces obscured by cowls, their movements silent and purposeful. This was not the nurturing embrace of a family, but the impersonal, almost sterile environment of an institution. She knocked, a soft, hesitant sound that seemed to be swallowed by the immensity of the stone. The sound reverberated through the quiet morning, a plea cast into the vast silence. After a moment, the wicket gate creaked open, revealing the weathered face of a monk. His expression, neither welcoming nor particularly hostile, but rather neutral, accustomed to such encounters. His eyes, Elias would later learn, were those of Brother Thomas, a man whose own past was a tapestry woven with threads of regret and obligation, and who now oversaw the abbey's charitable endeavors with a practiced, if sometimes weary, detachment. "What is it?" His voice was gruff, devoid of any undue emotion. Agnes's mother, her voice catching in her throat, could only manage a whispered plea. I have a child. I cannot keep her." She held Agnes out through the opening, presenting the infant like a sacrifice. The baby stirred, her tiny hand unfurling, seeking a familiar touch. Brother Thomas regarded the infant with a practiced gaze, his eyes scanning the child's small form, assessing her health, her potential. He saw not a beloved daughter, but a potential ward, an addition to the abbey's responsibility. There was no warmth in his appraisal, only a pragmatic consideration of resources. "A donation, then?" he asked, the word hanging in the air, heavy with its transactional weight. The mother nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, tracing clean paths through the grime. "Yes," she choked out, "a donation to the Abbey." She gently placed Agnes into his outstretched arms. The monk's hands, though rough, were surprisingly gentle as he cradled the infant. But there was no comforting pat, no reassuring word. He simply accepted the child as one might accept a delivery of grain or wine. She will be cared for, Brother Thomas stated, his tone final. It was a promise, perhaps, but one delivered with the sterile efficiency of a business transaction. He did not inquire about the mother's name, nor did he offer her any comfort or counsel. Her duty, in his eyes, was fulfilled. Agnes was now the Abbey's responsibility, and by extension, the church's. As Brother Thomas began to close the wicket gate, the mother's hand shot out, grasping at the cold stone. "Wait!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. May I see her? Just once more?" Brother Thomas paused, his gaze flicking back to the small bundle in his arms. He seemed to consider it, then shook his head. "The rules are clear. Once given, they are given fully. Any lingering attachment only hinders the path to piety." He offered no compromise. The separation had to be absolute for the good of the soul, or so the prevailing philosophy dictated. It was a severance, clean and uncompromising, designed to sever worldly ties and forge new ones with the divine. With a final ragged sob, the mother withdrew her hand. The wicket gate clicked shut, leaving her alone in the cold dawn. The vast stone walls of Saint Jerome, a silent, impenetrable barrier between her and her child. She stood there for a long time, the emptiness in her arms a physical ache, the silence of the Abbey a deafening roar in her ears. She turned and walked away, her footsteps slow and heavy, leaving behind the only tangible piece of her heart she had ever possessed. She was a mother, but she was also a woman who had made a bargain with necessity, a bargain that left her forever marked by absence. Within the Abbey's austere confines, Agnes was taken to a small, dimly lit chamber, one of several that served as a rudimentary nursery. Here, a handful of other infants and toddlers, similarly offered or abandoned, lay in simple wooden cradles. The air was thick with the smell of milk, damp linen, and the faint, cloying scent of incense that seemed to permeate every corner of the monastery. The room was functional, designed for containment and basic care, not for comfort or the intimate ministrations of parental affection. The monks who tended to them were not inherently cruel, but their approach was characterized by a profound lack of personal connection. Their duties were performed with a practiced routine, their interactions with the children brief and perfunctory. A hurried feeding, a quick change of soiled garments, a brief rocking to quell cries, these were the extent of their attentions. There were no lullabies sung with tender affection, no whispered words of reassurance, no gentle caresses that spoke of love. The children were wards of the Abbey, their emotional needs secondary to their physical sustenance and their eventual integration into the monastic life, if they were deemed suitable. Elias, during his brief, supervised exploration of the Abbey's grounds in the days that followed, would catch glimpses of this place. He would see the stoic figures of the monks moving through the corridors, their robes rustling softly, their faces often set in expressions of deep contemplation. He would hear the faint, plaintive cries of young children, sounds that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the stone walls, never quite reaching the sanctity of the chapel or the refectory. It was a world apart. a place where the innocence of childhood was met with the rigid order of monastic life, where familial bonds were replaced by communal responsibilities, and where the warmth of a mother's embrace was a distant, almost forgotten memory. The decision to place a child in a monastery was never taken lightly by parents, but the stark reality of survival often overshadowed the emotional toll. It was a testament to the harshness of the era, where resources were scarce and the needs of the many often outweighed the desires of the few. For families struggling with poverty, a monastery offered a solution, albeit a permanent and emotionally devastating one. It was a relinquishing of parental rights, a surrender of the dreams and hopes that accompany the raising of a child, all in exchange for the assurance that the child would not perish from want. The narrative of Agnes, of her mother's heartbreaking choice, and her own silent entry into the abbey's care was a microcosm of a larger, more pervasive reality. It was the story of countless children whose lives were shaped not by the loving hands of their parents, but by the impersonal, albeit often benevolent, custodianship of monastic institutions. These were the unacknowledged casualties of a world grappling with scarcity, the lives redirected by necessity, their youthful years spent within walls that promised salvation but offered little in the way of personal solace. Elias, still grappling with his own unbidden calling, found himself increasingly understanding the complex, often brutal, tapestry of human experience that lay beneath the veneer of piety and divine order. The monastery, he was beginning to realize, was not merely a sanctuary for the devout, but also a repository for the dispossessed, a final refuge for those whom life or their own families could no longer adequately shelter. The silence of the cloister was not always born of pious contemplation. Sometimes it was a silence enforced, a deliberate muffling of the world's clamor to better implant the abbot's own pronouncements. Elias had noticed it in the refectory, a hushed reverence that bordered on the unnerving. It wasn't just the quietude of shared meals, it was the expectant stillness that fell whenever Abbot Valerius graced the room with his presence. His voice, a melodious baritone, could coax hymns from the most recalcitrant throats, but Elias had begun to suspect it could also coax promises from minds weakened by more than just hunger. The practice of fasting, lauded in Scripture as a path to spiritual clarity, could in less scrupulous hands become a weapon of spiritual coercion. It was a delicate balance, Elias mused, between divine discipline and temporal manipulation. The abbot, a man whose piety seemed to emanate from him like a carefully cultivated fragrance, was a master of this particular tightrope walk. His pronouncements on the virtues of abstemiousness were frequent and impassioned, painting vivid pictures of the spiritual intoxication that awaited those who dared to deny their earthly appetites. He spoke of visions granted, of divine whispers heard only by those who had shed the distracting weight of physical needs. Consider the case of Sister Isolde. Her story, whispered in hushed tones amongst the younger novices, was a chilling testament to the perversion of such sacred practices. Isolde, a woman from a modest merchant family, had entered the Abbey of Saint Jerome not out of a deep-seated divine calling, but more as a means to secure a respectable future. Her family, though not impoverished, was not wealthy enough to afford a grand dowry, and the prospect of a cloistered life offered a certain stability, a guaranteed place in society, however removed from worldly pleasures. She had entered with a quiet but firm resolve, a pragmatic approach to her new life. But Abbot Valerius had other plans for Isolde. He saw in her a potential asset, a diligent soul whose spiritual fervor, once ignited, could be harnessed for the abbey's greater glory, and, Elias suspected, for Valerius's own reputation. He began by singling her out, showering her with what appeared to be spiritual guidance. His attentions were constant, his words laced with the promise of a profound spiritual awakening. He spoke of her unique sensitivity, her potential for a deeper connection with the divine. He convinced her that a period of intense fasting, a rigorous denial of all sustenance save water, was the key to unlocking this latent spiritual power. The scene of this spiritual grooming, Elias imagined, was often the refectory itself during periods of enforced quiet or private instruction. The long, bare tables, usually laden with simple fare, would be cleared. The scent of stale bread, of dried herbs, of that omnipresent incense would be replaced by the stark, almost sterile air of earnest persuasion. Abbot Valerius would sit opposite Isolde, his own plate meticulously arranged with a small, almost symbolic portion of food, a visual demonstration of his own spiritual discipline. He would speak of the saints who had endured weeks, even months without food, their bodies emaciated, but their spirits soaring. He would paint visions of celestial choirs, of angelic visitations, of a communion with God so profound that the memory of earthly hunger would vanish like mist in the morning sun. Isolde, young and impressionable, and perhaps already weakened by the initial stages of her fast, would listen, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The abbot's words were a potent elixir, far more intoxicating than any wine. He would describe the hunger pangs not as a sign of depletion, but as a herald of spiritual enlightenment, the soul's yearning for its divine progenitor. He would encourage her to embrace the gnawing emptiness, to see it as a void that God Himself would fill. The fasting itself was a gradual escalation. It began with lighter meals, with the omission of certain dishes, then certain days. Abbot Valerius would personally oversee her progress, offering her sips of cool water from a silver goblet, his touch lingering on her hand as he offered words of encouragement. "You are shedding the earthly coil, my child," he would murmur, his voice a soothing balm. "You are becoming pure, a vessel ready to receive the divine light." As the fasting intensified, Isolde's physical state began to deteriorate. Her eyes grew sunken, her skin pallid. Her movements became slow and uncertain. She was often dizzy, her thoughts fragmented. It was in this state of heightened vulnerability, of physical and mental delirium, that Abbot Valerius saw his opportunity. The refectory, no longer filled with the clatter of plates, would become the setting for the final act. He would seat her at a side table, away from the other sisters, ensuring their attention was elsewhere, perhaps engaged in their own silent prayer or mindful consumption of their meager meal. He would approach her, his presence radiating an almost hypnotic calm. He would speak to her of her progress, of the visions she was beginning to experience, often prompted by his own suggestive questioning. "Do you see the light, Isolde?" he might ask, his voice soft. "Do you hear the angels singing?" Isolde, her mind a haze of hunger and exhaustion, her senses distorted, might nod, her eyes unfocused, seeing not angels, but perhaps the dancing dust motes in the sunbeam or the intricate patterns on the stone floor. The abbot would interpret these fleeting perceptions as divine manifestations, further reinforcing her belief that she was on the precipice of spiritual transcendence. Then came the crucial moment. He would produce a document, a carefully worded vellum scroll, ostensibly a declaration of her newfound spiritual commitment, a formal profession of her vows to the abbey and to God. He would explain that this was a necessary formality, a way to seal her spiritual journey, to make her belonging to the divine order absolute. This is not a binding of chains, Isolde, he would assure her, his gaze steady, his voice imbued with a paternal warmth that belied the shrewd calculation in his eyes. This is the casting off of all earthly ties, the final surrender of your will to the will of God. Sign this, and you will be truly free. The words, truly free, would resonate in her weakened mind, a seductive promise in her state of profound deprivation. She craved freedom from the gnawing hunger, from the confusion that clouded her thoughts. She craved the divine communion Abbot Valerius so eloquently described. Her hand, trembling and unsteady, would grasp the quill. The act of signing, of making her mark on the parchment, would feel less like a conscious decision and more like the inevitable conclusion of a process that had stripped her of her agency. She would be guided, her hand steadied by the abbot's as she inscribed her name. The ink, as dark and permanent, would flow across the vellum, sealing her fate. In her delirium, she would not comprehend the true weight of those words, the irrevocable nature of the vows she was unknowingly professing. She would believe she was ascending to a higher plane, when in reality she was being bound by a meticulously crafted deception. The aftermath would be a cruel awakening, though not one that immediately dispelled the fog of her spiritual haze. The fast would be broken, often with a specially prepared, nutrient-rich broth, administered by the abbot himself, his approval evident in his gentle smile. He would praise her for her strength, her devotion. But as Isolde gradually regained her physical and mental faculties, the true implications of her profession would begin to dawn upon her. She would find herself irrevocably bound to a life she had never truly chosen, her future dictated by the opportunistic machinations of a man who had weaponized faith and exploited her vulnerability. Elias, listening to these fragmented tales, would feel a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had experienced the abbot's persuasive rhetoric firsthand, felt the subtle pressure to conform, to embrace the monastic ideal with unquestioning fervor. He had seen how the very atmosphere of the abbey, with its enforced piety and its emphasis on spiritual discipline, could be used to manipulate. The fasting vows, he realized, were not just about denying the body. They were about subjugating the mind, about creating a state of spiritual susceptibility that could be exploited by those with the will and the cunning to do so. The subtle scent of stale bread, always present in the refectory, now seemed to carry a more sinister undertone for Elias. It was the scent of vulnerability, of a hunger that went beyond the physical, a hunger for belonging, for purpose, for divine affirmation that could be so easily twisted and manipulated. The abbot, he understood, was not just a shepherd of souls. He was a strategist, a master of psychological warfare, who understood that in the battle for a soul, the most effective weapons were often those that were invisible, insidious, and cloaked in the guise of piety. The trick of the fasting vow was a testament to this grim reality, a reminder that even in the most sacred of spaces, the darkness of human ambition could find fertile ground to bloom. He saw how easily a spiritual fast could become a spiritual trap, a carefully orchestrated descent into a state where true consent was a casualty of spiritual hunger and the insidious whispers of ambition. The abbot's honeyed words were, for those like Isolde, a gilded cage, built with the bricks of faith and cemented with the mortar of deception, and within its confines, true freedom was the first casualty. Elias, clutching his satchel of tithes, felt a growing unease, a premonition that his own unbidden calling might lead him into similar treacherous waters where the sanctity of vows was a matter of convenience, and the line between divine guidance and human manipulation was perilously blurred. He began to question the very nature of his own presence here, wondering if his father's strategic placement was merely the first step in a longer, more intricate game played by men like Abbot Valerius. The allure of spiritual purity was beginning to feel like a dangerous illusion, a carefully crafted facade behind which more earthly and far less noble ambitions lay hidden. The refectory, with its echoing silence and the ever present aroma of sustenance denied, was no longer just a place of communal eating. It was a stage for spiritual theater where the performances of piety masked the often ugly realities of power and control. And Elias, an unwilling participant, was beginning to understand the script. The rough spun tunic of a serf, Elias had always imagined, was a garment designed for hardship. It was coarse, prone to snagging on thorns and briars, and offered little in the way of true comfort. The robes of the monks, however, presented a starkly different image. They hung with a certain dignity, a flowing grace that spoke of solemnity, and Elias had foolishly believed a degree of comfort far surpassing his own worn garments. This notion, a quiet seed planted by idle observation, had taken root in the mind of Thomas, a young man whose aspirations rarely stretched beyond the next meal or a dry patch of straw to sleep on. Thomas, a serf bound to the land as tightly as the roots of an ancient oak, had always possessed a dreamer's heart, albeit one tethered to a decidedly unromantic reality. His days were a monotonous cycle of toil, tilling the earth, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops under the watchful and often unforgiving eye of the local lord. The sun, a benevolent giver of life, also served as a relentless tormentor, baking his skin and leavening his sweat into a salt crust. The winters were worse, a bone-chilling assault that left him shivering in his thin tunic, the wind whistling through the chinks in the communal barn, where he, along with his brethren, sought meager shelter. It was during one particularly bleak winter, when the snow lay thick and unforgiving, and the chill seeped into the very marrow of his bones, that Thomas first truly saw the monks. A delegation from the Abbey of Saint Jerome had arrived in their village, ostensibly to collect tithes and offer spiritual guidance, though Elias, with his burgeoning suspicions, suspected their true purpose was more akin to assessing the local labor pool. They moved with an air of serene detachment, their dark woolen robes a stark contrast to the drab, earth-toned attire of the villagers. The fabric of their habits, Elias noted with a dispassionate eye, seemed thick and insulating, designed, no doubt, to ward off the very elements that were currently turning Thomas's knuckles blue. Thomas huddled against the unforgiving wind, watched them disembark from their sturdy, if plain cart. The brothers, their faces weathered but their expressions composed, seemed impervious to the biting cold. One of them, a portly friar with a surprisingly jovial countenance, even offered a cheerful nod in his direction. But it was the robes that captivated Thomas. They flowed, they draped, they seemed to whisper of a life insulated from the biting winds and the gnawing hunger. Compared to his own rough-spun tunic, which felt like wearing a bag of nettles, the monastic habit appeared to be the very epitome of comfort. Imagine, Thomas had murmured to his neighbor, a grizzled man named Silas, whose cynicism was as deeply ingrained as the dirt under his fingernails. Wearing that all day, no wind getting through, surely, and it looks so soft. Silas had merely grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Soft? It's wool, boy. Wool that's been spun and woven by hands that have never known the sting of frostbite while hauling a plow. And that dignity you see is just the comfort of a full belly and a roof that doesn't leak. But Silas's pragmatic pronouncements were no match for the romantic visions that Thomas conjured. He imagined the fabric, thick and yielding, a comforting embrace against the persistent cold. He pictured himself moving through the world, not hunched against the elements, but gliding serene and warm within the folds of that dark woolen shell. The life of prayer, which he dimly understood as the monk's primary occupation, seemed in his naive estimation a far more appealing pursuit than the back-breaking labor he endured. Surely, sitting in a warm chapel, chanting psalms, was infinitely more comfortable than wrestling with stubborn soil or cowering in a drafty barn. This fanciful notion festered, growing with each passing day of arduous labor and biting cold. When the opportunity arose, a chance encounter with a somewhat less discerning recruiter for the Abbey, who saw in Thomas a strong back and a ready obedience, Thomas seized it with both hands. He envisioned the monastic life as a celestial upgrade, a significant improvement in his material comfort, and a welcome reprieve from the relentless drudgery of his former existence. He pictured himself, at long last, ensconced in the luxurious warmth of a monastic habit, a sanctuary from the harshness of the world. His arrival at the Abbey of Saint Jerome was met with a reception that was by turns welcoming and bewildering. He was greeted by Brother Michael, a stern-faced man whose voice was as dry as ancient parchment, and was immediately set to work not in a warm chapel, but in the scriptorium. The famed woolen robes were indeed presented to him, along with other necessities for his new life. He took the habit, the rough wool scratching at his skin with an intensity that immediately dispelled any lingering notions of softness. It was coarse, heavy, and smelled faintly of dust and something vaguely unpleasant, like overripe fruit left to ferment. The initial days were a rude awakening. The dormitory, far from being a haven of warmth, was a cavernous hall with stone walls that seemed to radiate a perpetual chill. The beds were narrow pallets of straw, just as scratchy as the ones he'd known before, and the blankets were thin, offering little protection against the insidious draft that snaked through the ancient structure. The monks, while not overtly unkind, were distant, their lives governed by a rigid schedule that left little room for the casual camaraderie Thomas had vaguely anticipated. The chanting, he discovered, was not a comforting lullaby, but a demanding vocal exercise, often performed in unheated chapels where the cold air seemed to freeze the very breath in his lungs. His fingers, accustomed to the rough grip of a plowshare, fumbled with the delicate pages of the manuscripts in the scriptorium. The abbot's sermons, meant to inspire spiritual fervor, often left him more confused than enlightened, filled with abstract concepts and theological debates that seemed a world away from the practical concerns of a former serf. "You're looking a bit peaky, Thomas," remarked Brother Leo, a younger monk with a perpetually red nose, one particularly frigid morning as they prepared to attend matins. The pre-dawn air in the refectory was thick with the scent of stale bread and the chill of the stone floor. Thomas, his teeth chattering despite the thick habit he wore, could only manage a weak grimace. "It's colder than I thought it would be." Brother Leo chuckled, a dry, hacking sound. "Cold? This is nothing. Wait until you're out in the fields during harvest, or hauling water from the well in the dead of winter. This habit," he patted the woolen fabric with a resigned air, "is better than your old tunic, I suppose, but it's not a feather bed. And the stone walls, they hold the cold, you see. They don't give it up easily." Thomas's dreams of serene warmth were rapidly dissolving, replaced by the stark, unvarnished reality of monastic life. The wool of his habit, which he had imagined as a luxurious shroud, was in fact a scratchy utilitarian garment, effective enough against a moderate breeze, but utterly useless against the deep, bone-chilling cold that permeated the abbey. The monastic chill, as he began to call it, was a constant companion, a damp, pervasive cold that seemed to settle into his very bones, making the hours spent in prayer and contemplation feel less like a spiritual ascent and more like a prolonged period of suffering. The monotony he had vaguely anticipated was, in fact, a soul-crushing reality. The days were a repetitive cycle of prayer, work, and study with little deviation. The work itself was often tedious and unrewarding, from polishing the same brass candlesticks day after day to weeding the small, windswept herb garden where the herbs themselves seemed to shiver in the relentless wind. He longed for the simple, if brutal, physicality of his former life, for the clear, albeit harsh, objective of bringing in the harvest or mending a fence. Here, the objectives were often vague, the rewards intangible, and the comfort he had so naively craved was conspicuously absent. One afternoon, Elias found Thomas slumped against a cold stone pillar in a rarely used cloister, his usually hopeful face etched with a profound disillusionment. The celebrated monastic habit hung on him loosely, appearing less like a symbol of grace and more like a sackcloth of despair. "Brother Thomas?" Elias approached cautiously, his own senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the abbey's atmosphere. "Are you unwell?" Thomas looked up, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the dull gray of the overcast sky. "Unwell? I suppose I am. I thought this would be different." His voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the mournful sigh of the wind through the arches. "Different how?" Elias prompted, his mind already piecing together the likely source of Thomas's distress. The robes, Thomas said, running a rough hand over the coarse wool of his sleeve. They looked so comforting, so warm. In the life of prayer, I thought it would be peaceful, serene, not this constant cold and the endless sameness. He shivered, though the midday air was not as biting as it had been at dawn. My old tunic was rough, yes, but at least I knew what I was getting. This, he gestured vaguely at the abbey's imposing stone walls, this is just a colder kind of misery. Elias understood. Thomas's quest for comfort had been as misguided as his understanding of true spiritual discipline. The aesthetic appeal of the monastic life, the outward appearance of serenity and warmth, had been a powerful lure, but the reality was a starkly different affair. The abbey, like many institutions, was not built for comfort, but for endurance, for a resilience against the external world that often translated into an internal hardship. The wool, Elias said softly, more to himself than to Thomas, is meant to protect, but it does not always warm. And the spirit, Brother Thomas, must find its own warmth, independent of the fabric it wears. Thomas just nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant, frost-laden hills. He had traded one form of hardship for another. His naive pursuit of superficial comfort leading him into a deeper, more profound disillusionment. The imagined luxury of the robes had been a cruel illusion, a phantom warmth that evaporated with the first touch of the abbey's ever-present chill. The dark humor of it all, Elias mused, was that Thomas had sought solace from the cold, only to find himself enveloped in a more pervasive and far more disheartening form of it. His serf's tunic, for all its roughness, had at least been a testament to a tangible reality. The monastic habit, in his experience, had become a symbol of a dream that had frozen before it could even begin to take flight. The very garment he had thought would elevate him, that would insulate him from the world's discomforts, had instead become an itchy, unyielding reminder of his misguided hopes. It was a darkly comic tragedy, played out against the backdrop of drafty cloisters and the pervasive chill that seemed to be the abbey's true, unspoken virtue. He had sought a softer path, and instead found himself on one even colder, clad in the very attire he had once envied, which now served only to mock his folly. The wool, Elias realized, was not the problem. It was that expectation of warmth in a place that seemed to deliberately cultivate the cold. The Abbey of St. Jerome, a monolith of stone and piety clinging precariously to the windswept hills, was a place where time was not measured by the sun's arc across the sky, but by the relentless, sonorous pronouncements of its bells. These were not the gentle tinkling of a village church, but deep, resonant tolls that echoed through the vaulted ceilings and stone corridors, a constant, percussive heartbeat that dictated the very rhythm of existence within its walls. From the pre-dawn darkness of matins to the final, hushed vespers, the bells governed every waking hour, every moment of prayer, every shift of labor, and every precious, fleeting instant of sleep. They were the audible embodiment of monastic discipline, a symphony of obligation that underscored the stark reality of life, bound by the monastic vows. For Finian, a novice whose idealism had barely weathered a single harsh winter, the bells had become an almost physical presence, a ceaseless, echoing companion to his own burgeoning anxieties. He remembered, with a pang of bittersweet longing, the unfettered freedom of his village life, where the only chimes that marked the passing hours were the distant, melodic calls to prayer from the parish church, easily ignored amidst the clamor of daily life. Here in St. Jerome's, there was no escape. The bells were inescapable, their mournful clangor weaving itself into the very fabric of his thoughts, a constant, low grade torment that amplified his feelings of isolation and inadequacy. His mind, a restless entity, even in the relative quiet of the scriptorium, found the regularity of the bells particularly maddening. While his hands painstakingly copied ancient texts, painstakingly forming letters that seemed as alien to him as hieroglyphs, his thoughts would invariably drift. He'd find himself staring at the illuminated manuscripts, the vibrant inks and gold leaf, a stark contrast to the monochromatic existence he now inhabited, and his inner monologue would begin. Another hour gone, another hour closer to what? The same cold stone, the same scratchy wool, the same vacant stare from Brother Elias. His thoughts would scrawl across his mind's parchment, mirroring the very act of transcription with a grim irony. The bell for terce just rang. That means another session of manual labor, likely digging in the vegetable patch again. The mud will be everywhere. It always is. And the abbot will be watching, his eyes like flint, ensuring we haven't succumbed to the sin of idleness. Idleness, as if digging frozen earth with numb fingers, is the height of spiritual endeavor. The sound of the bells was intrinsically linked to the stark, echoing emptiness of the abbey's architecture. The cloisters, those arcaded walkways where monks were meant to engage in quiet contemplation, were vast expanses of cold, unforgiving stone. The sound of a single footstep would reverberate for an agonizing moment, amplified and distorted by the sheer volume of the space. When the bells chimed, the sound was not merely heard, it was felt, a physical vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, and by extension, Finian's resolve. Each toll was a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of his faith, a stark reminder of the unwavering demands of his new life. The routine, dictated by these sonorous pronouncements, was a relentless cycle of sameness. Rising before dawn, the biting chill of the dormitory piercing any lingering warmth from his palate, he would shuffle with the other novices to the chapel for matins. The stone floor radiated a cold that seeped through the thin soles of his sandals, an icy handshake that greeted him each morning. In the chapel, the air was even colder, the vast space echoing with the chants of the brothers. The bells would announce the start, punctuating the silence with a final, decisive clang. Then, the singing would begin, a monotonous plain song that for Finian often blended indistinguishably with the memory of the bell's final note. After matins came prime, then the quiet hour for reading or study, often in the scriptorium, then sext, and with it, the midday meal in the refectory. The refectory itself was a grand, yet stark hall. Long wooden tables, worn smooth by generations of use, stretched across the vast space. Silence was enforced, broken only by the reader's monotone recitation of scripture or the abbot's pronouncements. The food, usually a meager portion of bread and gruel, was sustenance, nothing more. And always, in the background, the ever present hum of the bells, a subtle but persistent reminder of their duty. Then came none, followed by another period of labor, perhaps tending the fields, or the infirmary, or the brewery. Whatever the task, it was punctuated by the scheduled tolls, each one a callback to the ordered existence of the abbey. Vespers would follow, then Compline, the final service of the day, after which the abbey would descend into a fragile quietude, a silence that for Finian was often more unnerving than the noise. He knew that even in sleep, the bells waited, ready to usher in the next cycle, the next day of unwavering, unvarying observance. The bells were not merely a timekeeping device, they were a psychological instrument, a tool of constant reinforcement, and for Finian, a subtle form of torture. He found his mind actively rebelling against their authority. While his body responded to the summons, his thoughts would create their own soundtrack, a dissonant counterpoint to the abbey's ordered symphony. Sext, another hour. The abbot said something about the new stained glass window today. Did he? I can't recall. My mind was on the scrape of Brother Silas's shovel against the stone path outside, a relentless grating sound, almost as persistent as the bells. Almost. His inner voice would trail off, leaving him with the echoing silence and the lingering sound of the bells in his memory. The stone corridors, slick with perpetual dampness in places, acted as natural echo chambers. The monks moved in procession, their sandals shuffling softly on the flags, a rhythmic accompaniment to the distant bells. Finian would sometimes pause, leaning against a cold, damp pillar, and listen. The sounds would converge, the shuffle of feet, the distant chanting, the mournful cry of a raven on the battlements, and above it all, the omnipresent, insistent chime of the bells. It was a soundscape designed to impress, to humble, to remind the soul of its place in the grand, ordered cosmos of God and the Church. But for Finian, it was a claustrophobic cacophony. He'd picture himself running, just running, away from the sound, away from the stone, away from the wool, away from the endless cycle. He'd imagine the bells fading into the distance, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the song of birds, the simple, uncomplicated sounds of a world outside these hallowed, yet suffocating walls. But the image would always dissolve, replaced by the stern visage of the abbot, or the disapproving gaze of Brother Michael, or most effectively, by the next resonant toll of the bell, yanking him back to his stark reality. The bells were the invisible chains that bound them, each chime a tightening of their hold. They marked the transitions, the movements from one place to another, from one duty to the next. They were the constant, irrefutable affirmation that life within St. Jerome's was not their own to command. It was a life lived according to a schedule as unyielding as the stone itself, a schedule laid out by a higher authority and broadcast, without mercy, by the tireless bells. Finian's internal struggle was a silent, desperate battle against this auditory tyranny. He tried to focus, to find solace in the prayers, to feel the divine presence the abbot spoke of. But the bells were a constant distraction, a siren song of obligation that pulled him away from introspection. Is this truly God's will? He'd wonder, his gaze fixed on a particularly intricate carving, on a capital, or just the will of men who decided that our lives should be measured in strokes of a clapper against bronze. The psychological impact was profound. The constant, predictable regularity could breed a sense of security for some, a comforting predictability in a chaotic world. But for Finian, it fostered a gnawing sense of futility. Each chime, rather than heralding a moment of spiritual connection, felt like another tick of a clock counting down to nothing. The days blurred into weeks, the weeks into months, all indistinguishable in their sonorous rhythm. The bells were the metronome of his monastic existence, and the tune they played was one of unchanging, unyielding duty. He would watch the older monks, their faces etched with years of such existence, and wonder if they ever felt the same. Did their minds also wander? Did they too yearn for a moment's respite from the percussive demands of the abbey? He saw resignation in their eyes, a quiet acceptance that seemed to mirror the stoicism of the stone walls themselves. But he also saw a flicker of something else sometimes, a shared weariness, a silent understanding that passed between them when the bells momentarily ceased their clamor, a brief interlude before the next call to order. The dark humor of it all, Finian mused one particularly bleak afternoon as the bells for Vespers began their sonorous announcement, was that he had sought a life of quiet devotion, a retreat from the noise and distractions of the secular world. Instead, he found himself immersed in a different kind of noise, a more pervasive, and in its own way, more insidious form of auditory control. The bells of St. Jerome's were a constant reminder that here, in this supposed sanctuary, his very consciousness was a shared resource, its attention and its time meticulously accounted for, announced, and commanded by the unceasing symphony of the bells. They were the masters of his day, the arbiters of his schedule, the ever present echoing voice of a life he was only just beginning to truly understand was a gilded cage. His initial dreams of spiritual serenity had been drowned out, replaced by the insistent, metallic insistence of the Abbey's auditory regime, each toll a confirmation of his confinement. The enforced quietude of the Abbey of St. Jerome was a deliberate architect of the soul, or so the abbot preached. Yet for Brother Silas, a man whose spirit was as unyielding as the granite from which the abbey was hewn, this silence was a cage of his own making, its bars forged from unspoken grievances and simmering frustrations. He was a man of action, of tangible results, his hands calloused from years of tending the abbey's sprawling vineyards, and his back accustomed to the strain of hauling stones for its unceasing repairs. Words, however, were a currency he traded in sparingly, his gruff demeanor and economical speech a testament to a life where deeds spoke louder than any eloquent plea. Within the scriptorium, this inherent reticence became a suffocating cloak. The air, thick with the scent of aging parchment and lamp oil, was punctuated only by the scratch, scratch, scratch of quills against vellum, a relentless, dry whisper that seemed to mock the torrent of unspoken thoughts churning within Silas. He sat at his designated station, the heavy wooden desk a familiar adversary, his task the meticulous copying of a theological treatise on the virtues of humility. Humility. The word itself felt like grit in his mouth, a bitter irony as he watched the younger novices, their faces alight with a naive fervor, diligently replicating the text with an almost desperate eagerness. Silas's frustration wasn't born of laziness, nor a disdain for the sacred words he was tasked with preserving. It stemmed from a deeper, more insidious source, the gnawing awareness that his own contributions, vital as they were to the Abbey's functioning, were deemed less significant, less holy than the painstaking work of a scribe. He'd spent the morning repairing a section of the cloister wall that had crumbled under the relentless assault of the winter winds. His muscles aching, his hands raw from the rough stone. He'd toiled under the ever watchful eye of Brother Thomas, whose gaze, though never overtly critical, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 silent judgments. And now, here he was, his mind still buzzing with the rhythm of hammer and chisel, forced to engage in a task that felt alien to his very being. The silence of the scriptorium was a magnifying glass for the soul's imperfections. Each rustle of parchment, each stifled cough, each sigh that escaped a neighboring monk's lips seemed amplified, distorted, and imbued with an unspoken commentary. Silas found himself increasingly sensitive to these minute sounds, their accumulation building a pressure behind his eyes, a tightness in his chest. He'd clench his jaw, his knuckles turning white against the rough wood of his desk, trying to impose order on the chaos of his thoughts. He would steal glances at the other monks, their faces masks of placid concentration. Were they truly so devoid of inner turmoil? Did their minds remain untroubled by the incessant demands of their vows, the stark simplicity of their lives? Silas doubted it. He saw it in the subtle tremor of Brother Bartholomew's hand as he dipped his quill, in the way Brother Michael's gaze would occasionally drift towards the high arched windows, as if seeking an escape beyond the thick stone. But unlike him, they seemed to possess the discipline, the ingrained obedience, to suppress these outward manifestations of their discontent. Silas, however, was a man who had always found solace in the physical, in the exertion of his will upon the material world. His frustrations, when they arose, would manifest as a tightening in his gut, a restless energy that demanded an outlet. In the vineyard, it was the satisfying thud of his hoe against the earth, the rough texture of the grapevines beneath his fingers. In the quarry, it was the clean crack of stone, the release of tension as a block was split precisely to his liking. But here, in this hushed sanctuary of ink and parchment, there was no such release. His energy festered, a slow burning ember within him. He tried to find solace in the scripture, to allow the words to seep into his soul and offer comfort. But today, the passages on patience and obedience felt like a mockery. He'd read the abbot's own pronouncements on the spiritual benefits of silence, how it allowed one to hear the divine whisper, to attune oneself to God's will. For Silas, however, the silence did not bring God closer. It brought his own anxieties closer, magnifying them until they threatened to consume him. The ink on the page blurred before his eyes. He'd meticulously copied a sentence about the blessedness of the meek, and his mind had conjured an image of himself, roaring his frustrations at the abbot, at the very walls of the abbey. He imagined the shock on the faces of the other monks, the scandalized whispers that would ripple through the cloisters, and then the inevitable consequence, expulsion or worse, a lifetime of penance in some isolated hermitage, a fate almost as bleak as his current existence. The silence, then, became a necessary evil, a self-imposed muzzle. He focused on the physical act of writing, on the formations of each letter, trying to channel his restless energy into the precise, controlled movements of his hand. He would count the strokes, the flourishes, the way the ink feathered on the vellum, anything to distract himself from the rising tide of his discontent. Brother Elias, a man whose life seemed dedicated to the meticulous cataloging of every speck of dust within the scriptorium, coughed softly nearby. The sound, barely audible, was enough to jolt Silas back to his immediate reality. He glanced at Elias, whose entire being seemed focused on the small, intricate illustration he was meticulously coloring. Elias's movements were slow, deliberate, almost glacial. There was a quiet intensity about him, a deep well of contained emotion that Silas suspected was also a form of suffering, albeit a far more passive one. Silas envied Elias's apparent serenity, his ability to lose himself in the minutiae of his task. Perhaps, Silas mused, he too could find a way to embrace this enforced quietude, to transform the silence from a burden into a tool. He tried to imagine the silence as a vast, empty canvas upon which he could paint his devotion, his obedience, but the colors he had available to him were all shades of gray, tinged with the dull ochre of his resentment. His gaze fell upon a passage describing the monastic ideal of detachment from worldly concerns. Worldly concerns, his family, the small farm he had left behind, the simple pleasures of a warm hearth and the honest labor. These were the very things that seemed to haunt him in the pervasive silence. He would recall the laughter of his younger sister, the scent of wood smoke curling from his mother's kitchen, the rough embrace of his father. These memories, vivid and potent, were like shards of glass in the otherwise smooth surface of his monastic life. He found himself unconsciously clenching his left hand, the thumb pressing into his palm, a familiar gesture that signaled the building of internal pressure. He needed to release it, but how? To speak his mind was to invite condemnation. To express his frustration was to betray his vows. The silence was a trap, and the more he tried to adhere to it, the more it seemed to ensnare him. He shifted in his seat, the rough wool of his habit scratching against his skin. The scraping sound of his chair against the stone floor seemed to echo unnervingly in the otherwise still air. He froze, his heart thumping against his ribs, half expecting Brother Elias to cast him a reproachful glance. But Elias remained absorbed in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. Silas returned his attention to the text, but the words no longer held any meaning. His mind had drifted again to the unforgiving demands of the vineyard. He remembered the day a sudden frost had threatened to destroy the young shoots, and he had spent the entire night wrapped in straw, tending a small bonfire, his body weary, but his spirit buoyed by the tangible fight against nature. That was a struggle he understood, a battle with clear stakes and discernible outcomes. This internal battle, waged in the quiet confines of his own mind, felt endless and unwinnable. He imagined the bells of the abbey, their sonorous tolls a constant reminder of the structured existence within these walls. They were the external manifestation of the internal discipline, a sound that both governed and, in its own way, punctuated the enforced silence. But for Silas, they were a distant echo, a reminder of a world that moved to a different rhythm. His own rhythm was one of suppressed energy, of a quiet defiance that manifested not in outward rebellion, but in a slow, internal erosion. He dipped his quill into the inkwell, the dark liquid seeming to mirror the somberness of his mood. He forced himself to focus, to replicate the painstaking script, to create the illusion of piety and peace. But within him, a different narrative was unfolding, a silent scream against the suffocating calm. He was a man bound by vows of silence, but his heart was a cacophony, a testament to the profound, often destructive power of unspoken words. The silence was not a balm for his soul, it was a crucible, and he was slowly, irrevocably being reshaped by its heat. He would continue to scratch his quill against the vellum, his outward conformity a stark contrast to the tempest brewing within, a testament to the silence that screamed loudest when no one dared to listen. The weight of expectation pressed down on Silas like the heavy stones he often moved. Each stroke of his quill felt like a tiny act of surrender, a concession to the prevailing order. He would watch the abbot, a man of immense presence and even greater austerity, glide through the cloister, his gaze sweeping over the monks with an unnerving intensity. The abbot's sermons often spoke of the inner peace that true obedience brought, of the liberation found in surrendering one's will to a higher purpose. For Silas, however, this surrender felt like a diminishment, a gradual erosion of his very self. He remembered the warmth of the sun on his face as he worked the soil, the earthy scent of freshly turned earth filling his lungs. These were sensations that felt more real, more grounding than the intellectual abstractions he was now tasked with copying. The treatise spoke of the prayer of the mind, of ascending to higher spiritual planes through contemplation. Silas's mind, however, seemed to prefer the tangible, the grounded reality of muscle and bone, of sweat and toil. The silence of the scriptorium was not merely an absence of noise, it was an active presence, a force that shaped the very thoughts of those within its embrace. It encouraged introspection, but for Silas, this introspection was often a descent into a spiral of discontent. He would find himself replaying conversations, dissecting every word, searching for hidden meanings and unspoken judgments. He'd replay his brief exchange with Brother Michael earlier that morning, when he'd accidentally brushed past the older monk in the refectory. Michael's polite, almost imperceptible flinch had felt to Silas like a condemnation of his very presence. He looked down at his hands, roughened and scarred from manual labor. They seemed so out of place here, amidst the delicate tools of the scribe. He imagined them soiled with earth, calloused and strong, capable of building and nurturing. Here, they were expected to be delicate, precise, almost ethereal. The contrast was a constant, nagging reminder of his perceived inadequacy. He tried to focus on the beauty of the illuminated manuscript he was copying, the intricate patterns, the vibrant colors, but even the artistry seemed to mock him, a testament to a level of dedication and refinement he felt incapable of achieving. He would trace the lines of a capital letter with his finger, feeling the raised texture of the ink, the subtle imperfections that hinted at the human hand that had created it. Yet, even these imperfections seemed more deliberate, more artful than his own fumbling attempts at piety. The silence amplified his internal monologue. Another sentence about abnegation. Abnegation? My life is nothing but abnegation. And for what? To sit here, copying words that seem to preach a life I cannot live? His thoughts were a torrent, a desperate attempt to articulate his unspoken grievances. He would bite his lip, forcing the words back down, swallowing his frustration like a bitter draught. He watched Brother Jude, a man who had been at the Abbey for over 20 years, meticulously sharpening his quill with a small, sharp knife. Jude's movements were economical, practiced, devoid of any wasted motion. There was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of settled resignation that Silas found both admirable and deeply unsettling. Did Jude ever feel this way? Did he ever long for a different life, a different path? Silas could never tell. Jude's face was a landscape of quiet contemplation, his eyes holding a depth that suggested years of unspoken stories. Silas found himself counting the seconds between the chimes of the Abbey bells, each interval a fleeting moment of relative quietude before the next resonant toll shattered the fragile calm. He would try to detach himself from the sound, to imagine it as something external, something that could not penetrate the inner fortress of his mind. But the bells were an inescapable part of the Abbey's very fabric, their mournful clang a constant reminder of his confinement. He imagined the scriptorium empty, the silence a vast, echoing expanse, where he could finally give voice to his frustrations. He would shout, he would rage, he would vent the accumulated pressure that had been building within him for months. But the image was always fleeting, quickly replaced by the stern reality of his surroundings, the watchful presence of Brother Elias, the ever-present weight of the Abbey's rules. He returned to his copying, his hand trembling slightly. He had reached a passage describing the virtues of quiet suffering. Suffering. He understood suffering. He understood the ache of tired muscles, the bite of cold wind, the sting of thorns in his hands. But this silent internal suffering, this constant battle against his own nature, was a different kind of torment altogether. It was a slow, insidious erosion, a chipping away at his very sense of self. He looked at the clock on the wall, its pendulum swinging with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Another hour gone, another hour closer to the end of his task. But the end of his task did not signify freedom. It simply marked the transition to another equally demanding duty. The silence, he realized, was not a respite from labor, but a different, perhaps more insidious, form of labor itself. The labor of suppression, the labor of conformity, the labor of denying the very core of his being. He would continue to scratch his quill, a silent scream echoing in the hollow chambers of his own mind, a testament to the suffocating power of enforced quietude. The communal refectory, with its stark, unadorned tables and the echoing silence enforced by rigid custom, was a place where spiritual aspirations often collided violently with the base, insistent demands of the flesh. For Brother Caddock, this was not a place of spiritual uplift, but a daily gauntlet of gnawing emptiness. The abbot's pronouncements on temperance and the renunciation of worldly comforts, while undoubtedly holding a certain elevated truth for those whose spirits soared unburdened by earthly needs, felt like cruel jests to a man whose stomach perpetually rumbled a mournful lament. His current reality was a stark departure from the hearty, if simple peasant's stew he had left behind in his village, a dish rich with the earthy flavors of root vegetables, often simmered with scraps of salt pork, a memory that now felt as distant and unattainable as the stars. Here, in the Abbey of Saint Jerome, his sustenance was a ritualistic offering of scarcity. The staple of their diet, a dense, dark bread, was baked from coarsely ground grain, a far cry from the softer, wheaten loaves enjoyed by the gentry, or even the more plentiful fare of the common folk outside these hallowed walls. It was often stale by the time it reached the refectory, its texture resembling hardened clay more than edible food. This bread was served in painstakingly measured portions, each slice a testament to the Abbey's commitment to rationing, a commitment that felt less like spiritual discipline and more like an ever present hunger. Alongside this bread, they received a thin gruel, a watery concoction of oats or barley, often devoid of any discernible flavor, save for a faint, metallic tang that hinted at the iron pots in which it was boiled. It offered little in the way of sustenance, a mere dampening of the fire in his belly, rather than a quenching of its flames. The silence in the refectory was a suffocating blanket, intended to foster contemplation and gratitude, but for Cadoc it served only to amplify the insistent drumming of his own empty stomach. Every scrape of a wooden spoon against a pewter bowl, every rustle of a rough wool habit, seemed to echo in the cavernous space, exacerbating the feeling of isolation, even amidst the company of his brothers. He would watch as Brother Thomas, a monk whose robust frame suggested a more forgiving relationship with the abbey's larders, consumed his meager portion with an almost serene indifference. Cada couldn't fathom it. How did some men seem to thrive on so little? Was it a divine grace, a spiritual fortitude he himself lacked? Or was it, perhaps, a more cunning ability to hide the very same pangs that twisted his own insides into knots? He found himself engaging in a silent, desperate inventory of his own body's failings. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, his thoughts often clouded by a persistent fog of weakness. The simple act of walking from his cell to the refectory, or from the refectory to the scriptorium, left him breathless, his heart pounding a desperate, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He would often lean against the cold stone walls, drawing in ragged breaths, trying to regain a semblance of composure before rejoining the silent procession of monks. His hands, once steady enough to wield a scythe or mend a fishing net, now trembled faintly as he lifted his spoon to his mouth. It was a humiliating testament to his physical decline, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the price of his chosen path. The spiritual ideal of austerity, so eloquently espoused by the abbot, was a lofty concept that seemed to lose its luster when faced with the visceral reality of an empty stomach. Cadoc understood the concept of mortification of the flesh, the idea that by denying the body's desires, one could elevate the spirit. But this was not mortification. This was a slow, agonizing depletion. It was the chipping away at his very being, leaving him feeling hollowed out, a shell inhabited by a perpetually dissatisfied void. His prayers, once filled with a fervent desire for spiritual enlightenment, were increasingly interrupted by images of plump chickens roasting over an open fire, of steaming bowls of lentil soup, of crusty loaves of bread slathered with butter. These were not temptations, he told himself. They were simply the desperate imaginings of a body starved for nourishment. He often found himself staring with an almost obsessive intensity at the small, rough hewn wooden bowls that served as their vessels. He would trace the grain of the wood with his eyes, imagining it filled to the brim with something substantial, something that would silence the persistent gnawing. The watery gruel that was actually served seemed to mock him, its thinness a visible manifestation of his own lack of substance. He would try to savor each spoonful to make it last, to trick his body into believing it was receiving a more generous offering. But the illusion was always short lived, the gnawing returning with a vengeance shortly after the bowl was empty. The silence of the refectory was not merely an absence of sound, it was a palpable entity, a thick, heavy presence that seemed to press down on his very being. It was a silence that demanded conformity, that discouraged any outward expression of distress. He would see the subtle signs of it in others: a clenched jaw, a downcast gaze, a hand unconsciously reaching to rub an empty stomach, but these were fleeting, quickly suppressed. The veneer of serene piety had to be maintained at all costs. To complain, to voice one's discomfort, was to betray a fundamental lack of faith, a failure to embrace the spiritual discipline that was the very foundation of monastic life. Kadok yearned for a different kind of silence, a silence born of contentment, of a spirit at peace. But this silence was born of hunger, of a body crying out for what it so desperately needed. He would try to focus on the spiritual aspects of their meal, on the blessings being offered, on the supposed divine presence in their midst. But the gnawing emptiness was a more insistent, more immediate reality. It was a physical ache that overshadowed any spiritual contemplation, a constant hum of discontent that drowned out the abbot's carefully chosen words of gratitude. He remembered the simple joy of a communal meal in his village, where laughter mingled with the clatter of dishes, where food was shared generously, and where the pangs of hunger were a temporary state, soon to be soothed by plentiful, hearty fare. There was a warmth, a camaraderie, a tangible sense of community that seemed utterly absent within the stark confines of the abbey's refectory. Here, the communal aspect was reduced to a shared experience of deprivation, a silent acknowledgement of their collective suffering. The contrast between the spiritual ideals of the abbey and the physical reality of its inhabitants was a source of constant internal conflict for Kadok. He had joined the monastic order with a sincere desire to dedicate his life to God, to seek a higher truth. He had believed that by renouncing worldly possessions and pleasures, he would find a deeper fulfillment. But the reality was a slow, insidious form of suffering, a constant battle against the most basic needs of his body. He wondered if he was failing in his spiritual duty, if his persistent hunger was a sign of his own weakness, his own lack of true devotion. He would sometimes catch himself staring at the other monks, their faces drawn and pale, their movements often lacking the energy and vigor he remembered from his village. Were they all suffering as he was, or was he alone in this persistent, debilitating weakness? He dared not ask, dared not voice the question that gnawed at him as relentlessly as the hunger itself. The silence was a powerful deterrent, a guardian of the abbey's carefully constructed image of spiritual serenity. The gruel, when it arrived, was a disappointment as always. A thin, grayish liquid with a few stubborn grains of oats clinging to the bottom of the bowl. He lifted his spoon, its rough wood familiar in his hand, and scooped up a small portion. He brought it to his lips, the meager warmth of fleeting comfort. He chewed slowly, trying to extract as much sustenance as possible from the insubstantial offering. His mind, however, drifted back to the memory of his mother's stew, the rich aroma, the comforting warmth that spread through his entire body. It was a memory so vivid, so potent, that for a brief moment he could almost taste it. Then, the reality of the gruel, thin and unsatisfying, would return, leaving him with a profound sense of loss. He would often see the younger novices, their faces still bright with the initial fervor of their commitment, their bodies not yet depleted by the rigors of monastic life. They would eat with a more apparent enthusiasm, their youthful energy seemingly capable of overcoming the deficiencies of their diet. But Cadoc knew from his own experience and from observing those who had been here longer that this initial resilience was a fragile thing. The persistent hunger would eventually take its toll, hollowing them out as it had hollowed him. The abbey's granary, while never entirely bare, was managed with a parsimony that bordered on cruelty. Brother Michael, the abbey's steward, was a man known for his meticulous accounting and his unwavering adherence to the abbot's directives. Every sack of grain, every barrel of flour was accounted for with an almost obsessive precision. While this ensured that the abbey's resources were managed efficiently, it also meant that there was rarely any surplus, any buffer against lean times or unexpected demands. The spiritual ideal of detachment from material wealth was in practice translated into a stark and often unforgiving rationing of necessities. Cadoc would often find himself daydreaming during the long hours of labor in the abbey's fields or in the chilly workshops. His mind would wander to images of abundance, of food freely given and readily available. He'd imagine a peasant's table laden with fresh bread, cheese, and fruit, or a hunter's feast with roasted game and rich gravies. These were not acts of gluttony, he told himself, but a desperate attempt to find solace in the realm of imagination, a way to escape the gnawing reality of his present circumstances. The gnawing edge of hunger was a constant companion, a shadow that followed him through his days and haunted his dreams. It was a physical ache that made prayer difficult, labor exhausting, and contemplation almost impossible. It was a testament to the brutal, often unacknowledged reality of life within the walls, a reality that stood in stark contrast to the idealized vision of spiritual austerity that the abbot so often preached. For Brother Cadoc, the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment was a journey paved with the bitter taste of hunger, a journey that often left him feeling weaker, not stronger, in his devotion. He would lift his spoon again, the thin gruel a pale imitation of the sustenance he craved, and in the echoing silence of the refectory, he would offer a silent, unvoiced prayer for a more substantial meal, a prayer that was as much about his body's desperate need as it was about his soul's yearning for peace. The gnawing persisted, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the physical toll of his spiritual aspirations. The air in the scriptorium was thick with the scent of parchment and dried ink, a fragrance that, for many within the Abbey of St. Jerome, was meant to evoke a sense of scholarly pursuit and divine contemplation. For Brother Bran, however, it was the smell of his own impending failure, a constant reminder of his unsuitability for the life he had, in a moment of profound, perhaps misguided faith, embraced. His hands, calloused and strong from years spent tending sheep on the windswept hillsides of his homeland, felt clumsy and alien as they clutched the delicate quill. The rough wool of his habit, usually a familiar comfort, now seemed to chafe and irritate his skin, an external manifestation of the internal discomfort that plagued him. He had come to the Abbey seeking solace, a respite from the harsh realities of a life lived at the mercy of the elements and the caprices of landowners. He had envisioned days filled with prayer, with honest labor, and with the quiet dignity of a life devoted to God. What he had not anticipated was this: the relentless, crushing weight of expectation, the expectation that a man who could read the sky like a book, who could predict the weather by the whisper of the wind and the behavior of the birds, could also decipher the intricate loops and curves of Latin script. The abbot, in his wisdom, or perhaps his boundless, if misplaced, optimism, had declared that all brothers were to contribute to the glory of God through various ministries. For some, it was the arduous physical labor of tending the monastery's fields, a task that, while demanding, at least allowed for a familiar engagement with the earth. For others, it was the diligent administration of the abbey's affairs, a path requiring a certain shrewdness and an understanding of worldly matters that Bran found as foreign as the language he struggled with. And then there were those chosen for the scriptorium, the keepers of knowledge, the transcribers of sacred texts, the illuminators of Holy Writ. It was a ministry of the mind, a realm of abstract thought and learned discourse, a realm to which Bran, a man whose world was shaped by the tangible realities of mud, wool, and bleeding flocks, felt he had no right to belong. His task for the day, as for many days before, was the copying of a theological treatise, a dense and labyrinthine exploration of the nature of divine grace. The abbot had presented it to him with a benevolent smile, explaining its importance with a fervor that left Bran feeling more bewildered than inspired. Brother Bran, he had said, his voice resonating with paternal authority, this work is a testament to the profound mysteries of our faith. To transcribe it is to participate in the very act of preserving divine truth for generations to come. Your devotion, though perhaps expressed through a different calling, is no less valuable in this sacred endeavor. The words were kind, the intention undoubtedly good, but they did little to assuage the gnawing fear that he was fundamentally incapable of fulfilling this charge. He dipped the quill into the ink pot, his hand trembling. The ink, black and viscous, seemed to mock the pale, faint lines of the text before him. He squinted, trying to make sense of the elegant, flowing script. Each letter was a tiny, perfectly formed entity, a miniature work of art in itself. But to Bran, they were an indecipherable tapestry of squiggles and flourishes, a language designed to exclude rather than to include. He remembered his childhood, the joy of learning the names of the constellations, the satisfaction of identifying different breeds of sheep by the sound of their bleating. These were skills, practical skills, honed through observation and experience. This, however, was something else entirely. This was a code, a secret language that the learned men of the Abbey seemed to speak with effortless grace, while he stumbled through it like a blind man in a crowded marketplace. He tried to recall the rudimentary Latin he had been taught during his initial weeks at the Abbey. Dominus, he mouthed silently, his tongue feeling thick and uncooperative. Deus. The words were there, familiar fragments in a sea of the unknown, but stringing them together, understanding the nuances of grammar, the subtle shifts in meaning conveyed by different word endings. This was an insurmountable hurdle. He would painstakingly copy a sentence, his brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue poking out between his lips, only to realize, after several agonizing minutes, that he had transposed two letters, rendering the entire phrase meaningless, or worse, heretical. Brother Thomas, a man whose hands were as adept with the pen as Bran's were with a crook, sat at the adjacent table, his movements fluid and precise. He seemed to glide through the text, his quill dancing across the parchment, leaving a trail of perfectly formed letters in its wake. He occasionally paused, not in confusion, but in thoughtful contemplation, his eyes lifting briefly to the high arched windows as if seeking inspiration from the heavens. Bran watched him with a mixture of awe and despair. Thomas had been a scribe's apprentice in a neighboring town before joining the Abbey, a past that explained his effortless mastery. Bran, on the other hand, had spent his youth wrestling with recalcitrant sheep and the stubborn earth. The abbot's decree that all monks should pursue intellectual development, regardless of their previous station or aptitude, was a noble sentiment, born from a desire to foster a truly unified community of learned men. Yet, for men like Bran, it felt less like an opportunity for growth and more like a profound betrayal of their inherent capabilities. He could mend a broken fence with skill and speed. He could track a lost lamb through the densest fog. He could judge the ripeness of a field of barley by the color of its stalks. These were valuable skills, skills that contributed to the Abbey's sustenance and prosperity. But in the eyes of the learned brothers, and indeed in the eyes of the abbot himself, these practical abilities seemed to hold little weight compared to the ability to discourse on the finer points of scholastic theology. He remembered the day he had arrived at the Abbey, a nervous young man carrying his meager belongings in a canvas sack. The abbot had greeted him warmly, assuring him that his past life, though humble, was no impediment to his spiritual journey. Every soul has a purpose within the divine tapestry, Brother Bran, he had said, his gaze earnest. The shepherd's keen eye, the farmer's strong back, the craftsman's skilled hand, all are gifts from God, to be honed and directed towards his glory. Here you will learn to read the scriptures, to understand the word of God, and to contribute to the spiritual enrichment of all. Bran had clung to those words, believing they offered him a path to a life of meaning and purpose, but the reality of the scriptorium was a far cry from the idyllic vision he had entertained. The sheer volume of text, the density of the theological arguments, the unfamiliarity of the language, it was all overwhelming. He would spend hours wrestling with a single paragraph, his mind a battlefield of confusion and frustration. He would try to immerse himself in the task, to find some meditative rhythm in the act of writing, but the constant fear of making a mistake, of defacing the sacred text, would always intrude, tightening its icy grip around his throat. He had tried to seek guidance, to approach Brother Thomas with a hesitant question, but the latter, while not unkind, was a man of few words, his patience seemingly reserved for the intricate intricacies of illuminated capitals and marginalia. Focus, Brother Bran, he would advise gently, gesturing to his own meticulously crafted work. Each stroke must be deliberate. There is no room for error when dealing with the Lord's own words. It was a statement of fact, not a criticism, yet it landed on Bran with the force of a condemnation. There were others like him, men who had come from similar backgrounds, men whose hands were more accustomed to the earth than to the quill. He saw it in their eyes, the same flicker of bewilderment, the same quiet struggle to keep pace. They were the unlettered, the ones for whom the intellectual endeavors of the abbey were a form of cruel and unusual punishment. They were the men who could shear a sheep with unparalleled efficiency, but who found themselves adrift in a sea of Latin prose. They were the men who could mend a leaky roof with remarkable speed, but who were paralyzed by the prospect of copying a single sermon. The abbot, in his earnest pursuit of intellectual excellence, seemed to overlook the fundamental disparity between the monastery's loftier aims and the practical realities of many of its inhabitants. He saw potential where others saw limitations, opportunity where others felt only inadequacy. He believed that through diligent effort, any man could ascend to the heights of theological understanding. But for Bran, and for many like him, the climb was too steep, the air too thin. He would sometimes fantasize about escape, about returning to the simple life of a shepherd, where the only texts he needed to read were the changing patterns of the scazi and the tracks of animals in the mud. But the vows he had taken, the deep-seated sense of obligation, held him fast. He had committed himself to this life, to this community, and to the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, however elusive it might seem. He dipped the quill again, the familiar metallic tang of the ink filling his nostrils. He focused on the first letter of the next word, a capital P that sprawled across the parchment like a proud peacock. He tried to mimic its form, to coax his own hand into replicating its elegant curves. He drew a tentative line, then another, his breath held captive in his chest. The result was a misshapen blob, a grotesque distortion of the intended form. A sigh escaped his lips, a sound lost in the hushed reverence of the scriptorium. He would have to erase it, a painstaking process that often smudged the surrounding text, leaving a faint, ghostly stain that served as a perpetual reminder of his ineptitude. The scriptorium was a place of both devotion and quiet despair. For the learned, it was a sanctuary, a place where the mind could commune with the divine. For the unlettered, it was a gilded cage, a testament to their perceived inadequacy. Bran, his fingers stained with ink, his spirit heavy with the weight of his unfulfilled promise, could only continue to grapple with the alien script, a silent testament to the profound, often unacknowledged curse of the unlettered within the walls of Saint Jerome. He knew that his journey towards spiritual enlightenment was, for him, inextricably bound to the arduous, often painful process of learning to read the words that held the very essence of that enlightenment. And with each clumsy stroke of the quill, he was reminded of the vast chasm that lay between his humble origins and the lofty intellectual aspirations of the life he now led. The ink stained not just the parchment, but his very soul, a constant, indelible mark of his struggle. The chill of the pre-dawn air bit at Elias's exposed neck, a familiar, unwelcome companion as he stumbled through the frigid stone cloister. Each measured pace was a calculated act of contrition, a perambulation of shame designed to etch the abbot's pronouncements into his very bones. The rhythmic scrape of his rough wool habit against the unforgiving flagstones echoed the frantic thudding of his heart, a desperate drumbeat against the oppressive silence of the abbey. He had been caught, not for anything grand, not for theft or heresy, but for a childish, foolish transgression, a clandestine bite of a stolen apple from the refectory stores, a sweet, forbidden fruit savored in the flickering candlelight of the dormitory long after the bell for vespers had tolled. Such a minor infraction, yet in the hallowed halls of Saint Jerome, even the smallest deviation from the sacred order was met with a swift and unyielding hand. Abbot Bernard, a man whose piety was matched only by his iron will, had presided over Elias's brief, terrifying hearing with an unnerving calm. His voice, usually resonant with pronouncements of divine love, had been a low, icy rumble as he detailed the gravity of Elias's offense. Theft, he had declared, his gaze piercing, is a violation of God's law, and the hoarding of his bounty, even for a moment's sweet indulgence, is an affront to the brotherhood. Discipline, young Elias, is the crucible in which true devotion is forged. It is the cold embrace that guides the straying lamb back to the flock. And so, Elias found himself here, undertaking 3 hours of this infernal cloister walk, a penance that felt as endless as eternity itself. His legs, still stiff from the day's labor in the monastery's vineyards, protested with every step. The rough stone beneath his worn sandals seemed to magnify the ache, sending tremors up his spine. He kept his eyes fixed on the damp, moss-covered stones directly ahead, refusing to acknowledge the stoic faces of the few early risers who shuffled past, their own duties calling them to prayer or to the scriptorium. Their averted gazes were a silent indictment, a confirmation of his shame. He could feel their judgment, a weight as tangible as the coarse wool against his skin. Brother Marcus, the abbey's appointed disciplinarian, a man whose very name seemed to conjure images of scourges and iron chains, stood sentinel near the cloister's central well. His face, a landscape of harsh lines and perpetual disapproval, was turned towards Elias, a silent clock marking the agonizing crawl of time. Marcus offered no comfort, no flicker of empathy, only a stern, unwavering presence that served as a constant reminder of the consequences of straying from the prescribed path. He was the embodiment of the abbey's unforgiving nature, a living testament to the belief that pain and suffering were necessary conduits to spiritual purity. Elias's mind, desperate for any escape from his present torment, flickered back to the moment of his transgression. It had been a foolish impulse, born of a gnawing hunger that the meager refectory meal had failed to satisfy. The scent of ripe apples, wafting from the storeroom, had been an irresistible siren call. He had slipped away during the communal prayer, his heart pounding a wild rhythm against his ribs. The apple, cool and firm in his hand, had been a brief, exquisite moment of defiance, a stolen sweetness that now tasted like ash in his memory. He had barely managed to swallow a few furtive bites before a gruff voice had echoed from the shadows. Brother Silas, his dormitory prefect, his face a mask of stern disapproval. The apple had tumbled from Elias's nerveless fingers, rolling across the stone floor like a discarded sin. Now, as he circled the cloister, the memory played on repeat, each repetition a fresh wave of humiliation. He tried to focus on the prayers Abbot Bernard had assigned him, the Pater Noster, repeated 1,000 times, but the words blurred, lost in the cacophony of his own self recrimination. Our Father who art in heaven. The hypocrisy of it gnawed at him. He was supposed to be a son of God, yet here he was, a common thief, a breaker of vows. The cloister itself seemed to conspire against him. The vaulted arches, designed to draw the eye heavenward, now seemed to press down upon him, suffocating him with their ancient grandeur. The occasional shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the gloom did little to warm the biting cold. Instead, they illuminated the dampness that clung to the stones, the pervasive chill that seeped into his very marrow. It was a place designed for contemplation, for quiet devotion, but for Elias, it was a stark reminder of his own spiritual nakedness. He heard the faint murmur of voices from the chapter house, the abbot's steady tone punctuated by the occasional assent of the other brothers. They were discussing matters of doctrine, of scripture, of the spiritual well-being of the community. And here he was, a novice, subjected to public shame, for a moment of childish weakness. He wondered if they spoke of him, if his disgrace was a topic of conversation within those hallowed walls. He suspected it was, a cautionary tale whispered amongst the learned brethren, a testament to the vigilance required to maintain the sanctity of their order. The hours stretched on, each minute an eternity. His muscles screamed in protest, his feet ached, and a profound weariness settled over him, a spiritual exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He longed for the warmth of his cell, for the simple, monotonous rhythm of his ordinary duties. But he knew that even those comforts were now tainted by his transgression. The abbot had made it clear discipline was not merely punishment, but a cleansing. He was being purged of his impurity, forced to confront the weakness that lay coiled within him. He saw Brother Thomas, his assigned confessor, emerge from the abbey church, his face etched with a familiar blend of compassion and professional detachment. Thomas approached him, his gaze steady, and Elias thought, perhaps a touch of pity in his eyes. Elias, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that barely disturbed the silence. The abbot has decreed that you are to contemplate the nature of temptation during your penance. Remember that even Christ was tempted in the wilderness, but he resisted. He did not yield. Elias could only nod, his throat tight. He knew the scripture, of course. He had heard it expounded upon countless times. But to truly understand it, to feel its resonance in his own soul, was another matter entirely. His temptation had been small, earthly, the allure of a forbidden fruit. Christ's had been the temptation of power, of worldly dominion. How could his petty theft possibly compare? Yet, the abbot had insisted on the parallel, equating his weakness to a universal struggle. Do you understand the lesson, Elias? Thomas pressed gently, his hand resting briefly on Elias's shoulder, a fleeting moment of human contact that sent a shiver through him. Ah, I think so, Brother Thomas. Elias managed to croak out, the words feeling hollow and unconvincing. Thomas gave a slow, deliberate nod. Good. Remember, even in your weakness, there is strength to be found. The strength to endure, the strength to learn, and the strength to ultimately overcome. He gave Elias's shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze before turning and continuing his own solitary walk around the cloister, his measured steps a stark contrast to Elias's agonizing shuffle. As the sun climbed higher, its weak rays finally managing to cast longer shadows, Elias felt a subtle shift in his own resolve. The initial agony of shame and fear began to be overlaid by a dull ache of endurance. He was still miserable, still consumed by the knowledge of his transgression and the abbey's judgment, but a flicker of something else had ignited within him. It was a stubborn refusal to be utterly broken, a quiet defiance against the crushing weight of his penance. He would endure this. He would learn. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would emerge from this cold embrace of discipline, not entirely unscathed, but with a grim understanding of the boundaries that defined his life within these hallowed, unforgiving walls. The apple had been a small thing, but the lesson it had brought was proving to be a monumental weight, a chilling testament to the unyielding nature of monastic discipline. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within his soul, that this was just the beginning of his education in the true meaning of obedience, an education conducted in the unforgiving crucible of consequence. The path ahead, he suspected, would be fraught with such trials, each one a test of his commitment, each one a reminder that the abbey's embrace, while spiritual, was often chillingly cold. The scent of damp earth and the sweet, almost cloying perfume of ripening apples hung heavy in the air. Elias knelt, his knees protesting against the cool, packed soil of the monastery's orchard, his gloved fingers carefully working around the base of a young sapling. It was a task designed for quiet reflection, a physical manifestation of tending to God's creation. Yet his mind, as it so often did these days, drifted. The abbot's sermons, Brother Thomas's gentle admonishments, the arduous hours of cloister walks, they all faded into a dull background hum whenever the faintest whisper of the world beyond these ancient stones managed to penetrate the thick stone embrace of St. Jerome. Today, the whispers were carried on the rough woolen tunic of Brother Silas, the same prefect who had discovered Elias's apple pilfering escapade. Silas, a man whose jowls seemed to perpetually sag with the weight of spiritual disapproval, had been tasked with procuring new grafting tools from the market town a day's ride away. He'd returned not only with the requested implements, but also with a veritable bounty of gossip, which he'd, in his usual gruff, perfunctory manner, disseminated during the midday meal. Elias, though relegated to the backbenches, had strained to catch every word, his soul a thirsty sponge, soaking up the forbidden knowledge. Silas spoke of Elias's eldest brother, Thomas, who was apparently thriving. His marriage to Lady Eleanor, a union brokered for land and influence, had produced a son, an heir. Elias imagined Thomas, now a lord in his own right, overseeing his estates, his hands calloused not from prayer beads, but from the reins of his favorite horse. He pictured him in richly dyed tunics, his laughter booming across a feasting hall, a stark contrast to the hushed, reverent tones that echoed within St. Jerome. Then there was Geoffrey, his second eldest. Geoffrey, always the restless one, had joined a company of mercenaries, seeking glory and coin in some distant, sun drenched kingdom. Silas had described him with a mixture of disdain and reluctant admiration, a man living by the sword, his life a constant gamble, but a life lived undeniably with a fierce, untamed energy that Elias found himself envying. The descriptions, delivered with Silas's characteristic bluntness, painted vivid pictures in Elias's mind. He heard of bustling marketplaces, the clang of swords, the joyous cries of children. He tasted the imagined sweetness of ale, felt the rough wool of a merchant's cloak, the fleeting warmth of a stranger's smile. These were not the abstract concepts of divine grace or spiritual enlightenment. These were the gritty, visceral realities of life lived outside the cloistered walls, a life that felt increasingly like a distant, unattainable dream. His own life, by comparison, seemed a study in muted tones. His days were a predictable cycle of prayer, labor, and meager meals, punctuated by the abbot's pronouncements and the constant gnawing awareness of his own perceived failings. The transgression with the apple, though seemingly trivial, had become a focal point for his growing discontent. It was a symbol, he felt, of his inability to fully conform, of the persistent earthy desires that clung to him like the vineyard soil to his boots. He paused in his work, letting the trowel rest on the ground. The sun, high overhead, dappled through the leaves of the apple trees, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow. A bee buzzed lazily past his ear, its industrious hum a gentle counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. He could hear the distant murmur of voices from the monastery's scriptorium, the scratch of quills on parchment, a sound that once had represented a sanctuary of learning, but now seemed merely another facet of his gilded cage. Then, carried on a faint breeze that rustled the leaves above him, came a new sound. It was the distant, melancholic strumming of a lute, accompanied by a rough, untrained voice, singing a ballad about a knight and his lady fair. The melody was simple, plaintive, and utterly captivating. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a sound from out there, a sound that spoke of a world where love was sung, where heroes jousted, where life was not a measured, somber pilgrimage, but a vibrant, often dangerous adventure. He realized with a jolt that the troubadour must be a traveler, perhaps a pilgrim of sorts, passing along the road that skirted the monastery lands. The very existence of such a traveler, a free soul untethered by vows and schedules, was a testament to the existence of a world Elias was forbidden to touch. He found himself leaning forward, straining to catch more of the song, his meticulous work on the sapling completely forgotten. The lyrics, fragmented and indistinct, painted images of moonlit dances, whispered vows, and the thrill of forbidden encounters. A wave of yearning washed over him, so potent it felt like a physical ache. He imagined himself not kneeling in the dirt, but astride a horse, the wind in his hair, the lute song guiding him towards some unknown, exciting destination. He saw himself, as his brothers were, navigating the complex currents of the world, forging his own destiny, experiencing the raw, unvarnished emotions that were so carefully suppressed within these walls. He glanced around, a nervous energy coursing through him. Was anyone watching? Brother Silas was likely back in the scriptorium, engrossed in his own somber duties. The other brothers were scattered throughout the monastery grounds, each occupied with their assigned tasks. He was alone, or at least he hoped he was. The idea of being caught, staring wistfully into the distance, his mind wandering far from the hallowed earth, was almost as mortifying as his apple related disgrace. He tried to pull his thoughts back to the sapling, to the task at hand. Tend to God's creation, the abbot had admonished them. But how could he tend to this small, rooted plant when his own soul yearned for the boundless expanse of the sky? The contrast was too stark, too cruel. His brothers' lives, as imperfect and perhaps as dangerous as they might be, represented freedom. His own life, cloaked in the guise of devotion, felt increasingly like a slow, spiritual suffocation. He recalled another detail Silas had let slip, something about his youngest brother, a brother he'd barely known, who had been sent to train as a scribe in a distant city. Silas had mentioned that this brother, a quiet, bookish lad named Benedict, had been caught attempting to leave the city and join a traveling troupe of players. He'd been apprehended, of course, and presumably punished, but the very fact that he had tried, that he had dared to chase a dream so utterly antithetical to their family's obligations and their own upbringing, stirred something within Elias. It was a seed of defiance, a whisper of rebellion that resonated deeply with his own burgeoning dissatisfaction. The lute music faded, carried away by the wind, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of the monastery. But the echo of those melodies, the images they conjured, lingered. Elias felt a subtle shift within him, a hardening of resolve that was as unwelcome as it was undeniable. The cloister walk had been a punishment for a small sin, but these whispers from the outside world were planting seeds of a far greater rebellion, a rebellion of the spirit. He looked at the young sapling, its leaves unfurling towards the sun, a symbol of life and growth. And for the first time, Elias felt a kinship with that nascent life, a shared yearning for the light, for the space to grow beyond the confines of his prescribed existence. The outside world, with its chaos and its temptations, no longer seemed like a place of damnation, but a beckoning horizon. The whisper had become a siren's call. He buried the trowel in the earth with a decisive jab, the motion more forceful than necessary. His gaze swept across the sun-drenched orchard, taking in the rough-hewn stone walls that encircled them, the towering bell tower that marked the rhythm of their lives, the distant, hazy outline of the hills beyond. Each element, once a symbol of divine order and protection, now felt like a barrier, a cage meticulously constructed to keep something vibrant and alive, something that was stirring within him, from ever truly breaking free. The apple had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, but these whispers, these fleeting glimpses of another life, were becoming something far more dangerous, a choice. And Elias, for the first time, found himself contemplating the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of choosing the world beyond the whispering leaves. The discipline of the cloister might forge devotion, but the allure of the outside was forging a different kind of strength within him, a strength born of longing and a desperate, burgeoning hope. The seeds of discontent, sown by the very words meant to reinforce their sacred vows, were beginning to take root, watered by the forbidden melodies and the imagined lives of men who were not bound by the unyielding silence of Saint Jerome. The air within Saint Jerome was thick not just with the scent of aged parchment and penitent sighs, but with the unwritten, unspoken rules that governed every breath. Elias had always been a creature of quiet contemplation. His rebellions, if they could even be called that, were internal battles fought against the rigid doctrines that sought to strip him of his individuality. He yearned for the world beyond the stone walls, a world glimpsed in fleeting whispers and carried on the wind, a world that felt both terrifying and exhilarating in its untamed freedom. Yet, even in his quiet longing, he was beginning to understand that the monastery, for all its enforced piety, was not a monolith of submission. Within its very structure, like persistent weeds pushing through flagstones, bloomed the art of subtle rebellion. This wasn't the dramatic defiance of a heretic shouting their convictions from the rooftops, nor the outright rejection of vows that led to excommunication or exile. This was a far more intricate dance, a sophisticated game played by those who understood the rules well enough to bend them, to twist them, to find the tiny loopholes that offered moments of reprieve, of self expression, of a whispered, "I am still here." It was the ingenuity born of constraint, the quiet insistence of the human spirit, refusing to be entirely extinguished by the suffocating embrace of absolute control. Consider, for instance, Brother Bartholomew, a man whose hands, calloused by years of manual labor, had once known the smooth heft of dice and the thrill of a well-placed wager. His past life, a tapestry woven with the threads of taverns and backroom games, had been traded for the austere robes of a monk, yet the gambler's spirit, it seemed, was not so easily shed. Elias had observed Bartholomew during their shared hours in the scriptorium, noting the way his fingers, ostensibly tracing the lines of sacred texts, would sometimes twitch with the forgotten rhythm. He'd see Bartholomew discreetly pass a small, crudely carved wooden bird from one brother to another, a flicker of a shared glance, a barely perceptible nod. Later, Elias would overhear hushed conversations, cryptic references to the flock or the good harvest, which upon closer inspection seemed to map out a complex system of bets placed on anything from the outcome of the abbot's sermons to the number of crows that would land on the bell tower in a single day. Bartholomew's gambling was not a loud disruption. It was a silent current beneath the placid surface of monastic life. The wooden carvings, perhaps, served as markers, their intricate, almost abstract shapes holding a meaning known only to the initiated. A pecked eye could signify a win, a smoothed wing a loss. The passing of these tokens was an act of faith in itself, a trust placed in a fellow monk's discretion, a silent acknowledgement of a shared transgression. It was a way for Bartholomew to keep a flicker of his old self alive, to engage in the mental gymnastics of odds and probability, a stark contrast to the predetermined path of monastic existence. And for those who participated, it offered a small illicit thrill, a momentary escape from the predictable piety of their days. It was a reminder that even within the confines of vows, the human desire for risk, for a little bit of chance, could not be entirely eradicated. Then there was Brother Silas, the very man who had so diligently reported Elias's apple transgression. Silas, a man whose life seemed dedicated to upholding every jot and tittle of monastic law, also possessed his own peculiar brand of subversion. Elias recalled Silas's penchant for elaborate, almost theatrical pronouncements during communal meals. While ostensibly upholding the abbot's teachings, Silas would often embellish his retellings of Scripture, adding colorful details and dramatic pauses that went far beyond the original text. It was a subtle reinterpretation, a form of passive performance that elevated his own status while subtly mocking the dry rigidity of the very rules he enforced. His delivery was so earnest, so seemingly devout, that few would dare question it. Yet Elias, with his growing awareness of the subtle currents within the monastery, recognized the undercurrent of amusement, the sly manipulation of narrative. Silas was not breaking rules. He was performing them, and in doing so, he was bending them to his own will, creating a spectacle that, while ostensibly devotional, was also deeply personal. He was a master of the art of making the mundane seem extraordinary, and the extraordinary, well, the extraordinary was simply part of his daily sermon. Elias himself had begun to engage in his own small acts of defiance. The careful tending of the sapling in the orchard, a task meant to foster humility and connection to the earth, had become Elias's private theater of rebellion. He would deliberately select the most aesthetically pleasing branches to prune, shaping the young tree not just for health, but for a certain graceful form, a silent testament to his own artistic sensibility. He would also, when his duties allowed, linger a moment too long in the orchard, not just to appreciate the beauty of God's creation, but to feel the sun on his face, to listen to the distant sounds of the outside world, to savor these stolen moments of awareness that were entirely his own. He would often hum the fragments of melodies he'd heard, the tunes of the world beyond, letting the notes drift on the breeze, a silent offering to his own rebellious spirit. These were not acts of malice, but of self-preservation, tiny acts of reclaiming a sense of self in a place that sought to erase it. The ingenuity of these monks was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find expression even in the most restrictive environments. It was in the carefully crafted excuse to spend extra time in the library, ostensibly for study, but really to pore over forbidden texts, historical accounts that spoke of different ways of living, of heroes and villains and passions that were far removed from the cloistered serenity of St. Jerome. It was in the coded language used in passing messages, a system of allegorical references to saints and biblical events that masked entirely secular intentions. Arrangements for illicit trading of goods, perhaps, or the clandestine sharing of news from the outside. There was also the matter of the herbal remedies. While officially sanctioned to be used for the infirmary, certain monks, possessing a deeper knowledge of the natural world, would prepare potent concoctions that went beyond mere healing. These brews could induce vivid dreams, sharpen the senses, or even offer a temporary respite from the gnawing hunger that often accompanied their meager Lenten fare. Elias had once witnessed Brother Anselm, a quiet man with a profound knowledge of plants, preparing a pungent mixture of herbs, his lips moving in a silent prayer that seemed more incantation than supplication. Anselm had later gifted Elias a small pouch of dried leaves, advising him to steep them in hot water and drink them before sleep for clarity of thought. The resulting dreams were indeed vivid, filled with landscapes Elias had never seen, people he'd never met, a potent elixir for his starved imagination. It was a dangerous practice, for any unauthorized medicine could be seen as a rejection of divine providence. Yet Anselm, like Bartholomew and Silas, operated in the shadows, his quiet rebellion a testament to his refusal to let his knowledge and his curiosity be wholly suppressed. These acts, small and seemingly insignificant, were the threads that held the fabric of their hidden lives together. They were not grand gestures, but persistent whispers of individuality, of human connection, of the irrepressible desire to live, truly live, even within the confines of stone and dogma. They were the secret smiles exchanged over a shared glance, the whispered jokes that broke the solemnity of prayer, the small comforts and joys cultivated in the most unlikeliest of places. Elias understood that the path to his own escape, if such a thing were ever possible, would not be paved with grand pronouncements or open defiance, but with the careful cultivation of these subtle acts of rebellion, each one a small victory, a quiet assertion that even within the monastery's embrace, his spirit remained his own. The ingenuity of these men, their ability to find pockets of freedom within a system designed to eliminate it, was a revelation. It was a stark reminder that humanity, in its infinite capacity for adaptation and its unyielding desire for something more, would always find a way to bloom, even in the harshest of soils. And Elias, watching them, learning from them, began to understand that the true strength of Saint Jerome was not in its walls, but in the silent, unyielding resilience of the souls within. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of prayer, labor, and the abbot's sermons, each one a variation on the theme of abnegation. Yet, Elias's perception had irrevocably shifted. He no longer saw his fellow monks as merely fellow penitents, but as individuals navigating their own private battles, each with their own secret strategies for survival. He saw the subtle wink exchanged between Bartholomew and another monk after a particularly daring bet was settled, the almost imperceptible smirk on Silas's face as he expertly twisted a biblical passage to his own advantage, the knowing glance he received from Brother Anselm when he shared a particularly potent dream. These were not acts of betrayal against God, but acts of fidelity to themselves, a quiet affirmation that the spark of individuality could not be entirely quenched. The very structure of monastic life, with its emphasis on communal living and shared tasks, paradoxically provided the perfect environment for these subtle rebellions to flourish. The constant proximity of the brothers meant that alliances could be forged in hushed whispers during shared work or prayer. The rigid schedule, while oppressive, also created predictable patterns, allowing for calculated risks and meticulously planned deviations. A monk who might ordinarily be ostracized for his unconventional behavior could find a measure of acceptance among those who shared his quiet discontent, creating a network of unspoken understanding and mutual protection. Elias began to experiment himself, starting with the smallest of transgressions. He would deliberately linger in the refectory after the meal, feigning a moment of prayerful contemplation to discreetly pocket a crust of bread or a forgotten piece of fruit, provisions for a secret midnight snack, a small act of defiance against the imposed austerity. He found himself developing a keen eye for opportunity, a heightened awareness of the fleeting moments when supervision was lax. He learned to mask his intentions behind a veneer of piety, his gaze downcast, his posture demure, while his mind was a whirlwind of calculation and anticipation. One evening, while assisting Brother Thomas in the monastery's apiary, Elias found himself drawn to the rhythmic hum of the bees. Thomas, a gentle soul whose primary solace seemed to be the sweet, golden honey produced by his charges, was meticulously tending to the hives. Elias, ostensibly helping to collect honeycomb, noticed Thomas carefully setting aside a small portion of the raw honey, wrapping it in a clean linen cloth, and concealing it within his tunic. Later, as they walked back towards the monastery, Thomas, under the guise of offering Elias a taste of the day's harvest, discreetly passed him the small bundle. "For a weary soul," he'd murmured, his eyes conveying a message far deeper than the words themselves. Elias understood. This was not merely a gift of honey, it was an offering of shared humanity, a quiet acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried. It was a defiance of the strict rules that dictated every portion of their sustenance, a small act of generosity that transcended the austerity of their vows. It was a taste of freedom, a sweetness that came not just from the honey, but from the shared secret. This unspoken solidarity, this quiet understanding amongst those who sought something more, became a lifeline. Elias realized that even those who outwardly appeared most devout, most compliant, might harbor their own hidden desires, their own secret rebellions. The monastery, far from being a uniform mass of subservient souls, was a complex ecosystem of individuals, each finding their own unique ways to navigate the constraints placed upon them. The art of subtle rebellion was not about breaking free entirely, but about carving out small spaces for selfhood, for agency, for a whispered affirmation of life in the face of enforced uniformity. It was about the quiet courage to be oneself, even when the world around you demanded you be someone else entirely. And Elias, breathing in the honeyed air, felt a growing sense of belonging, not to the rigid order of Saint Jerome, but to the hidden community of rebels, united by their shared, silent defiance. His own yearning for the outside world was no longer a solitary ache, but a shared melody, played softly in the hidden corners of their cloistered lives. The dawn, when it finally bled through the narrow high windows of St. Jerome, did so with the grudging reluctance of a condemned man. For Elias, each sunrise was a fresh stab of awareness, a stark reminder that the gilded cage he inhabited was not temporary, but eternal. He had, with the others, uttered the sacred vows, binding himself to poverty, chastity, and obedience. These were words meant to signify liberation, a shedding of worldly tethers for the freedom of spiritual devotion. But for some, the weight of those pronouncements settled not as a blessing, but as a crushing, inescapable burden. There were men within St. Jerome, Elias knew, whose internal compass had spun wildly off course, leaving them adrift in a sea of regret. He saw it in the way Brother Thomas, the gentle apiarist, would sometimes gaze out at the distant, shimmering haze of the valley, his eyes holding a depth of longing that spoke of a life unlived, a path untraveled. Thomas had joined the order in his youth, a period of fervent idealism that had since curdled into a quiet, gnawing despair. His vows, once a beacon of hope, had become the iron bars of a cell from which there was no release. Elias had witnessed, on more than one occasion, the almost imperceptible tremor in Thomas's hands as he worked the hives, a physical manifestation of an internal tremor that shook him to his core. This realization that his monastic commitment was not a trial period, but a life sentence, was a particularly bitter pill for those who had entered the order under duress, or perhaps, more insidiously, under the sway of a youthful idealism that had long since faded. Elias recalled Brother Michael, a man whose portly frame seemed to strain against the coarse woolen habit, his jovial demeanor a thin veneer over a profound unhappiness. Michael had spoken once to Elias in a moment of unguarded vulnerability of a betrothal he had broken, a woman whose laughter he could still hear in the quietest hours of the night. His parents, devout and influential, had decreed that his life belonged to God, and so, with a heavy heart and a forced smile, Michael had acquiesced. Now, years later, the weight of that familial expectation, coupled with the undeniable pull of a love renounced, had left him adrift. His vows were not a choice made freely, but a debt paid under duress, a chain forged by others and clasped irrevocably around his own soul. The claustrophobia Elias felt was not solely a product of the stone walls that pressed in on all sides, but of the suffocating immutability of his own situation. He saw it most vividly in the small, Spartan cells where the monks spent their nights. Elias's own cell, a mere cubicle furnished with a straw mattress, a simple wooden stool, and a crucifix, became a stage for his quiet anxieties. He would sit on the edge of his cot, the rough wool of his habit scratching against his skin, and watch the candlelight flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his own stagnant existence. The shadows, elongated and distorted, warped the familiar contours of his meager possessions, transforming them into grotesque caricatures of his hopes and dreams. The air in his cell was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint, lingering aroma of the communal prayers, a scent that was meant to be comforting, to evoke a sense of shared devotion, but which for Elias had come to represent the suffocating sameness of his days. He would trace the rough-hewn stone of the wall with his fingertips, feeling the cold, unyielding surface, a tangible representation of his own trapped state. Each breath he took seemed to draw in not just air, but the very essence of his confinement. His vows, initially a promise of spiritual freedom, now felt like shackles, each uttered word a link in a chain that bound him tighter and tighter to a life he had not truly chosen. He remembered the fervent, almost feverish conviction with which he had approached his ordination, a conviction that had felt as real and potent as any earthly passion. He had believed, truly believed, that he was answering a higher calling. But the relentless rhythm of monastic life, the endless cycle of ritual and obedience, had a way of eroding even the most deeply held convictions. The divine purpose he had once perceived had become obscured by the mundane, the repetitive, the utterly predictable. He would lie awake at night, the silence of the monastery amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat, a frantic drum against the stillness. He would replay the moments leading up to his final vows, dissecting every decision, every whispered word of encouragement from his mentors, every justification he had offered himself. Had he been naive? Had he been coerced, subtly or otherwise, by the sheer weight of expectation from his family and the community he had grown up in? The answers, when they came, were not comforting. They were a tangled knot of half truths and self deception, a testament to the insidious way in which well intentioned doctrines could ensnare the unwary. There was a pervasive sense of entrapment that Elias saw reflected in the eyes of many of his brethren. It was a quiet desperation, a resignation that settled over some like a shroud. He witnessed it in the vacant stare of Brother Gabriel, a man who had once been known for his fervent sermons and his charismatic presence, but who now seemed to drift through his duties like a ghost, his voice barely a whisper during communal prayers. Gabriel had confided in Elias, after a particularly arduous day of manual labor in the fields, that he felt like a prisoner of his own faith. "I took vows, Elias," he had said, his voice raspy, "not to serve God, but to escape myself. And now I find myself trapped with the very thing I was trying to flee, only worse, for now I have no other company but my own regret." This sentiment, the idea of using the monastery as a means of escape from internal demons, was a recurring theme in Elias's observations. For some, the monastic life was not a deliberate choice of spiritual path, but a desperate attempt to outrun their own pasts, their own perceived failings. They sought in the rigid structure and enforced piety a penance, a way to cleanse themselves of sins real or imagined. But the irony, Elias mused, was that the very act of seeking refuge within the monastery often served to amplify the internal turmoil. The constant introspection, the forced contemplation, the lack of distraction from the outside world, all served to bring the unacknowledged issues to the forefront, where they festered and grew in the oppressive stillness. He imagined himself on the outside, breathing the unfettered air of the world beyond St. Jerome. He would walk through bustling marketplaces, his senses assaulted by a cacophony of sounds and smells, his eyes drinking in the vibrant colors of life. He would feel the warmth of the sun on his face, unmediated by stained glass, and hear the laughter of people who were not bound by solemn vows or the constant specter of divine judgment. But these were fleeting fantasies, ephemeral images that served only to deepen the ache of his present reality. The path back to that world, so if it ever existed, seemed impossibly long and fraught with insurmountable obstacles. His ordination, his vows, his very identity within this sacred order, all formed a formidable barrier, a wall of social and spiritual obligation that seemed utterly impenetrable. The weight of societal expectation was another invisible but potent chain. In the eyes of his family, his community, and indeed the church itself, Elias was a man set apart, a chosen vessel. To forsake his vows, to return to the secular world, would not merely be a personal decision, it would be a public renunciation of his sacred calling, a source of shame for his family, and a scandal for the order. This pressure, the unspoken understanding that his life was no longer his own, was a constant, gnawing presence. He was a man bound by more than just his own promises. He was bound by the expectations of a world that had placed him on a pedestal from which it was all but impossible to descend without shattering both himself and the perceptions of those who admired him. Elias found himself staring at his hands, the hands that had once sketched, that had once traced the lines of poetry in his youth, now calloused and rough from manual labor. They were the hands of a monk, subservient, disciplined, obedient. But deep within, a different set of impulses still stirred, a longing for creation, for expression, for a life lived with vibrant, uninhibited passion. He felt like an actor who had been forced onto a stage to play a role he no longer believed in, the script rigid, the performance unending. The vows, meant to signify a surrender to divine will, and for many become a surrender to despair, a silent testament to the unyielding nature of a commitment made perhaps too soon, too fervently, or too falsely. And in the flickering candlelight of his cell, Elias began to truly understand the terrible, unforgiving permanence of a vow that had, over time, transformed from a sacred promise into an unbreakable chain. He was a man who had sought freedom in devotion only to find himself more deeply imprisoned than ever before, the iron of his vows chilling him to the very marrow of his soul. The chill of the monastery was a constant companion, a damp, insidious seep that permeated not just the stone walls, but the very fabric of their lives. Brother Thomas, who had been drawn to the order by a romanticized vision of the monastic life, a vision painted in hues of spiritual serenity, and, let's be honest, the undeniable allure of a ready-made habit, found himself perpetually at odds with the reality of his chosen attire. He had imagined the wool, the very material that cloaked him, to be a soft, almost caressing embrace, a comforting shroud against the harshness of the world he had left behind. Instead, it was a constant, abrasive accusation against his skin, a perpetual scratchy reminder of his miscalculation. The wool, perpetually damp from the ubiquitous moisture that clung to Saint Jerome like a second skin, offered no warmth, only a clammy, clinging discomfort that chafed and irritated. He'd once confided, in a moment of desperate candor, that he sometimes felt like he was wearing a particularly unloved sheep. The irony, of course, was that this wool, meant to signify a detachment from worldly vanity, had become for Thomas a source of acute daily mortification. He'd envisioned a life of elevated thought and spiritual repose, a serene existence where the physical world faded into insignificance. But the physical world, in its most basic, inconvenient forms, refused to be ignored. The pallets, too, were a cruel joke played upon the weary body. Not the soft, yielding beds of his imagined sanctuaries, but hard, unforgiving planks, often covered with a thin, brittle layer of straw that offered all the cushioning of a collection of dried twigs. Elias, in his own cell, would lie awake, the hard angles of the wooden frame pressing into his bones, each shift a minor negotiation with discomfort. He'd often think of the knights of old, ensconced in their padded armor, venturing out to battle. They, at least, had some semblance of lumbar support. His own nights were spent wrestling with an adversary that offered no quarter, a nightly battle against the relentless, unyielding nature of wood and straw. The dawn, when it finally arrived, found him not refreshed, but stiff, his muscles protesting the long hours of enforced stillness. And the chapels, oh, the chapels, these were the epicenters of a spiritual chill that went far beyond the mere absence of heat. The vast, echoing spaces, designed for grand pronouncements and solemn rituals, were often furnaces of cold. The stone, radiating the memory of winter nights, seemed to actively suck the warmth from the very air. During matins, as the first pale light struggled to penetrate the high arched windows, the monks would huddle together, their breaths misting in the frigid atmosphere, their prayers often punctuated by involuntary shivers. Elias remembered one particularly bleak winter morning when the water in the font had frozen solid, a glittering testament to the unyielding embrace of St. Jerome's eternal winter. He'd watched Brother Francis, a man whose piety was as robust as his constitution seemed frail, attempt to chip away at the ice, his chapped fingers fumbling with a small, inadequate chisel. It was a scene both pathetic and, in a grim sort of way, profoundly illustrative of their existence. And then there was the food, the sustenance so essential, so fundamental, yet so often a source of further, if muted, despair. Elias recalled the communal meals, the long refectory tables where the brethren sat in silent, stoic consumption of whatever meager fare had been prepared. It was often a variation on a theme of gruel, root vegetables boiled into a state of mushy submission, and the occasional precious sliver of dried fish that tasted vaguely of the barrel it had resided in for far too long. He remembered one particular dish, a concoction of barley and turnip, that had been so bland, so utterly devoid of any discernible flavor, that it had inspired a quiet, desperate humor amongst some of the younger monks. Brother Bartholomew, a man with a surprisingly keen palate that had clearly not been consulted during the menu planning, had once, during a rare moment of unguarded conversation, whispered to Elias that he suspected their cooks were actively trying to invent new ways to render food utterly uninteresting. He'd confessed to sneaking extra salt into his portion, a clandestine act that felt akin to treason, but one that offered a fleeting, almost sublime relief from the monotony. The bread, too, was a study in fortitude. Dense, heavy, and often slightly sour, it required a considerable amount of chewing, a process that seemed designed to make one appreciate the very act of swallowing. Elias had seen men, his fellow monks, meticulously buttering their meager portions with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, a desperate attempt to inject some semblance of pleasure into their sustenance. The paradox was stark, and Thomas, in his quiet, melancholic way, embodied it perfectly. He had sought the robes, the spiritual raiment, imagining a life of ease, a life buffered from the vulgarities of the world. He had, in essence, traded one set of discomforts for another, arguably more insidious set. The physical abrasions of the wool, the bone-deep chill of the chapels, the uninspired monotony of the meals, these were not the grand existential torments he might have anticipated from a life of religious devotion. They were the small, persistent indignities, the constant low grade friction that over time wore away at the spirit with a relentless precision. He had imagined a sanctuary, a place of respite, but had found instead a meticulously constructed environment of subtle, persistent hardship. It was a form of discomfort so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the very architecture of their lives, that it became almost imperceptible to many, a low hum of irritation that simply faded into the background noise of their existence. Yet, for those like Thomas, and increasingly for Elias, it was a constant nagging reminder that the promised comfort of their chosen path was at best a cruel illusion, a gilded cage whose bars were not made of iron, but of damp wool and unforgiving wood. He had, after all, expected a spiritual embrace, a divine warmth that would insulate him from earthly woes. Instead, he found himself wrapped in a perpetual state of mild, yet unyielding physical unpleasantness. It was a testament to the peculiar, often darkly humorous way the universe seemed to operate, offering solace only to snatch it away, leaving behind a faint, lingering scent of damp wool and regret. The very austerity that was meant to purify the soul seemed in practice to inflict a slow, methodical martyrdom upon the body, a silent testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest discomfort could be found not in overt suffering, but in the persistent, unacknowledged absence of ease. The damp chill of Saint Jerome's was a constant, a persistent whisper of discontent that seemed to seep from the very stones. Brother Thomas, whose initial vision of monastic life had been painted with the soft hues of spiritual serenity, and let's face it, the undeniable practicality of a pre-made wardrobe, found his reality to be a rather more abrasive affair. He'd imagined the wool of his habit to be a gentle caress, a comforting embrace against the harshness of the world he'd renounced. Instead, it was a perpetual scratch, a constant reminder of his perhaps overly romanticized decision. This wool, forever clinging with a damp, clammy insistence, offered no warmth, only an irritating friction that chafed against his skin. He'd once confided to Elias, in a rare moment of unguarded despair, that he felt as though he were perpetually clad in the pelt of a particularly disgruntled sheep. The irony, he mused, was that this garment intended to signify a detachment from worldly vanities had become for him a source of daily, low-grade mortification. He'd sought a sanctuary for the soul, a retreat from the vulgarities of existence, but had instead found himself immersed in a meticulously crafted environment of persistent, subtle discomfort. The physical world, so it turned out, had a remarkably tenacious grip. His nights were no less forgiving. The pallets, those stark wooden slabs adorned with a meager scattering of brittle straw, offered all the ergonomic support of a pile of dried thistles. Elias, lying awake in his own cell, felt the unyielding angles of the wood press into his very bones. Each shift in position was a negotiation, a silent battle against an adversary that offered no quarter. He'd find himself picturing the knights of old, swathed in their padded armor, venturing forth into battle. At least they, he thought wryly, had some semblance of lumbar support. His own nocturnal struggles were against an opponent that promised only stiffness and a profound appreciation for the morning light, not as a herald of spiritual awakening, but as a mere cessation of physical torment. The dawn, when it finally broke, found him not refreshed, but creaking, his joints protesting the long hours of enforced immobility. And the chapels, oh, the chapels, these were the epicenters of a chill that transcended mere thermodynamics. The vast, echoing spaces, designed for grand pronouncements and solemn rituals, were often furnaces of cold. The stone, radiating the stored memory of countless frigid nights, seemed to actively leach the warmth from the very air. During matins, as the first weak shafts of light attempted to pierce the high arched windows, the monks would huddle together, their breath misting in the frigid atmosphere, their prayers often punctuated by involuntary shivers that ran through the assembled ranks, like a collective silent exhalation. Elias recalled one particularly bleak winter morning when the water in the baptismal font had frozen solid, a glistening, crystalline testament to the unyielding embrace of St. Jerome's perpetual winter. He'd watched Brother Francis, a man whose piety seemed inversely proportional to his physical resilience, attempting to chip away at the ice with a small, inadequate chisel, his chapped fingers fumbling with the stubborn, frozen water. It was a scene both pitiful and, in its own grim way, profoundly illustrative of their shared existence. And then there was the food, the sustenance so vital, so fundamental, yet so often a source of further, albeit muted, despair. Elias remembered the communal meals in the refectory, the long tables where the brethren sat in silent, stoic consumption of whatever meager fare had been prepared. It was a recurring motif of gruel, root vegetables boiled into a state of mushy submission, and the occasional precious sliver of dried fish that seemed to have retained the faint, briny memory of the barrel it had inhabited for an eternity. He vividly recalled one particular dish, a concoction of barley and turnip, that had achieved a level of blandness so profound, so utterly devoid of any discernible flavor, that it had sparked a quiet, desperate amusement amongst some of the younger monks. Brother Bartholomew, a man blessed with a surprisingly discerning palate that had clearly been overlooked in the menu planning, had once, during a rare moment of unguarded conversation, confessed to Elias that he suspected their cooks were actively engaged in a clandestine pursuit of inventing novel methods to render food utterly uninteresting. He admitted, in hushed tones, to the occasional clandestine addition of salt to his portion, a furtive act that felt akin to sacrilege, but one that offered a fleeting, almost sublime respite from the overwhelming monotony. The bread, too, was a study in endurance, dense, heavy, and frequently tinged with a subtle sourness. It demanded a considerable amount of mastication, a process that seemed deliberately designed to imbue the very act of swallowing with a profound sense of accomplishment. Elias had witnessed men, his fellow monks, meticulously buttering their meager portions with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics, a desperate, almost pathetic attempt to inject some semblance of pleasure into their sustenance. The paradox was stark, and Thomas, in his quiet, melancholic way, seemed to personify it. He had sought the robes, the spiritual vestments, envisioning a life cushioned from the vulgarities of the world. He had, in effect, traded one set of discomforts for another, arguably more insidious set. The physical abrasions of the wool, the bone deep chill that permeated the chapels, the uninspired monotony of the meals. These were not the grand existential torments he might have anticipated from a life dedicated to divine contemplation. Rather, they were the small, persistent indignities, the constant low grade friction that over time wore away at the spirit with a relentless, almost surgical precision. He had envisioned a sanctuary, a haven of spiritual ease, but had instead found himself within a meticulously constructed environment of subtle, persistent hardship. It was a form of discomfort so pervasive, so deeply woven into the very fabric of their existence, that for many it became almost imperceptible, a low hum of irritation that simply faded into the background noise of their days. Yet, for those like Thomas, and increasingly for Elias, it was a constant, nagging reminder that the promised comfort of their chosen path was at best a cruel illusion, a gilded cage whose bars were not forged of iron, but of damp wool and unforgiving wood. He had, after all, expected a spiritual embrace, a divine warmth that would insulate him from earthly woes. Instead, he found himself wrapped in a perpetual state of mild, yet unyielding physical unpleasantness. It was a testament to the peculiar, often darkly humorous way the universe seemed to operate, offering solace only to snatch it away, leaving behind a faint, lingering scent of damp wool and regret. The very austerity that was intended to purify the soul seemed in practice to inflict a slow, methodical martyrdom upon the body, a silent testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest discomfort could be found not in overt suffering, but in the persistent, unacknowledged absence of ease. It was during one of these particularly bleak periods, when the winter seemed to have settled in with a permanent, icy grip, that the monks began to discover a peculiar form of camaraderie, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of mutual misery. It started subtly, with a knowing glance exchanged across the refectory table when a particularly uninspired gruel was served. Then came the hushed whispers, the barely suppressed chuckles that would erupt during the interminable sermons on the virtues of self denial. For Brother Thomas, the wool of his habit, once a source of acute discomfort, became an unlikely prop in this unfolding drama of shared absurdity. He found himself, during the long hours of manual labor in the frigid scriptorium, idly tracing the patterns of the coarse fabric with his fingernail, each scratch a tiny private rebellion. One afternoon, while attempting to illuminate a particularly dull passage on the theological significance of sackcloth, his quill snapped, splattering ink across the pristine vellum. Instead of the expected shame or frustration, a wave of uncontrollable laughter seized him. It wasn't a joyous sound, but a choked, wheezing eruption, born of the sheer, ridiculous futility of his efforts. He looked up to see Brother Elias, his own face etched with a similar, weary amusement, nodding in silent comprehension. This nascent spirit of shared levity, though fragile, began to blossom in the most unexpected of places. During the daily litanies, where the monks chanted their petitions in unison, a collective sigh of exasperation would sometimes ripple through the ranks when the icy draft from the north transept would sweep through the chapel. It was in these shared moments of physical discomfort that the threads of their common experience began to weave themselves into a tapestry of dark humor. They found a strange solace in recognizing the shared ridiculousness of their predicament. The forced celibacy, a cornerstone of their vows, became a subject of hushed, often ribald jokes whispered behind clasped hands. One evening, after a particularly bland supper of boiled cabbage, Brother Jude, a man known for his booming laugh that was rarely heard within the monastery walls, leaned over to Elias and whispered, "Do you think if we prayed hard enough, God would send us a salt shaker? Or perhaps a small, artisanal cheese?" The absurdity of the suggestion, so utterly at odds with their austere vows, resonated with a desperate humor that Elias found himself unable to resist. A faint smile, a rare and precious commodity, touched his lips. It was during these informal, clandestine gatherings, a stolen moment by the well, a brief respite from chores in the monastery gardens, that the monks truly found each other. They would share anecdotes, each more outlandish than the last, about their misguided reasons for seeking refuge within St. Jerome's hallowed yet unforgiving walls. Brother Michael, who had originally joined the order, hoping to escape a particularly persistent debt collector, recounted how he'd spent the first week of his novitiate hiding in the privy, convinced that every creak of the floorboards was the sound of his pursuer. Brother Gabriel, a man of immense physical strength, who had been tasked with polishing the seemingly endless rows of brass candlesticks, confessed that he often found himself talking to them, lamenting the sheer, unyielding tedium of his duties. "They don't talk back, you know," he'd confided to Thomas, his voice a low rumble of weary resignation. "Not even a grunt. Just shine, shine, shine. They're like the wool of our habits, really, just there to make you uncomfortable." The shared misery, the collective wrestling with the absurd, began to forge bonds that piety alone could not have achieved. They discovered that laughter, even when it was a hushed, sardonic sound, could be a powerful antidote to the pervasive gloom. It was a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity, a recognition that even in the most rigorously controlled environment, the human spirit possessed an indomitable, if often peculiar, resilience. They learned to find amusement in the most mundane of occurrences. The daily processions, where the monks walked in single file, their heads bowed in solemn contemplation, became opportunities for subtle, synchronized winks, for perfectly timed, almost imperceptible nudges. The very austerity that was meant to crush their individuality became paradoxically the fertile ground upon which their shared humor could flourish. They were, in essence, creating their own solace, not from divine intervention, but from the sheer, unadulterated ridiculousness of their existence, a testament to the enduring power of wit in the face of overwhelming and often rather damp adversity. It was a grim sort of mirth, born of necessity, but it was mirth nonetheless, a flicker of light in the perpetual twilight of St. Jerome's. This shared amusement, this finding of levity in the ludicrous, was not a renunciation of their vows, but a subtle, almost subversive adaptation to the realities of their chosen path. They were, in their own quiet way, enduring, not solely through faith, but through the shared, weary understanding that sometimes the only way to survive the absurd is to laugh at it, even if the laughter is as cold and damp as the very walls that contained them.